In the suffocating heat of the Vietnamese jungle, a lone recon sniper was about to vanish into the undergrowth. A routine scouting mission turned into a deadly engagement when the Viet Cong, confident in their hidden canopy nests, made their first mistake. They thought they were the only hunters in these woods. Jack Merritt wasn't just another Marine with a rifle. For 18 months, he had been the unseen specter of the battlefield, a precision sniper whose kills were whispered about in enemy camps. His legend was carved in the silent takedown of entire VC squads and the impossible shots that turned the tide of ambushes. When the Viet Cong opened fire from their treetop platforms, they believed they had the advantage. What they didn't realize was that they had just become targets in a hunting ground Jack had already mapped. With each pull of his trigger, the trees that had hidden them became their graves and the jungle itself turned against them. What began as a reconnaissance mission became a ghost story the Viet Cong would never forget. The jungle, once their sanctuary, would become their graveyard after one man proved that even the shadows had a predator. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humidity clung to Jack Merritt's skin like a second layer, his camouflage fatigues soaked through with sweat despite the pre-dawn chill. He moved through the Vietnamese jungle with practiced silence, each step calculated, deliberate. His M40 sniper rifle felt like an extension of his body after 18 months in country, its weight a comfort against the relentless unease of the dense foliage surrounding him. 5 meters ahead, Sergeant Daniel Hawk Riggins moved with similar precision, occasionally lifting a closed fist, the signal to halt. Jack froze mid-step, becoming as still as the trees around him. His breathing slowed to near imperceptibility, a technique that had earned him the call sign Ghost among the Marines of his unit. The jungle breathed for him, its cacophony of insects and distant bird calls masking any sound that might betray their presence. Hawk's hand motioned forward again, and they continued their advance. The recon mission was straightforward. Locate the Viet Cong battalion that had been decimating American patrols for the past 3 weeks, mark their position, and get out. Intelligence suggested the enemy was using the canopy as cover, building platforms in the trees to rain down death from above while remaining virtually invisible. It was a tactic that had proven devastatingly effective. Movement, Hawk whispered, his voice barely audible above the jungle sounds. He pointed to a section of underbrush about 70 meters ahead. 2 o'clock. Jack adjusted his position, bringing the scope of his rifle to his eye. Through the magnified lens, he scanned the area Hawk had indicated. Nothing at first then. There. A flash of black fabric, the distinctive outline of an AK-47. He pulled his eye from the scope and nodded to Hawk, who was already marking the coordinates on their map. "That's the 4th scout we've spotted," Hawk murmured, his voice tight with concern. "They're establishing a perimeter." Jack's jaw clenched. "Or they already know we're here." The words had barely left his mouth when the first tripwire glinted in the growing dawn light, stretched across their path. Hawk spotted it simultaneously, and they both froze, exchanging a glance loaded with understanding. They weren't just in enemy territory, they were in a trap. With deliberate movements, Jack knelt and examined the wire without touching it. It ran to a cluster of bamboo, likely rigged to a grenade. Standard VC technique, but no less deadly for its simplicity. He signaled for Hawk to backtrack, finding a route around the deadly trigger. "We need to radio this in," Hawk whispered as they navigated around the trap. "The rest of the team needs to be warned." Jack nodded, unslinging the radio pack from Hawk's back. He kept his voice low as he transmitted their coordinates, detailing the enemy presence and the traps they'd encountered. Lieutenant Walker's voice crackled back, distorted but clear enough to understand. "Copy that, Ghost. Position confirmed. Extraction point remains Whiskey Niner. Hold your position and await further orders." "Negative," Jack responded, his Montana drawl more pronounced under stress. "Request permission to continue reconnaissance. We've got a line on their position but need visual confirmation of the tree platforms." There was a pause, filled only with static. Then, "Permission granted." But at the first sign of trouble, fall back immediately. You're too deep to risk engagement. Copy that. Ghost out. Jack handed the radio back to Hawk, who secured it with practiced efficiency. A flicker of unease crossed Hawk's features. Concern, perhaps, or premonition. But it was quickly replaced by his characteristic half-smile. "You ever think about becoming a farmer when we get back?" Hawk asked, his voice still barely above a whisper. "My old man's got 40 acres in Kentucky. Says he'll split it with me if I make it home." Jack allowed himself a small smile. This was Hawk's way of easing tension. Random questions about a future they both knew might never come. "Montana's got better hunting," he replied simply. Hawk chuckled silently. "You and your mountains." They moved forward again, deeper into the jungle, deeper into danger. The light grew stronger as dawn approached, filtering through the dense canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with every breeze. It made the shadows dance, turning every movement into a potential threat. The attack came without warning. A single shot shattered the humid air, followed instantly by the unmistakable chatter of AK-47s. Not from ahead, but from above. The tree platforms. They'd walked right under the enemy position. "Contact!" Hawk shouted, diving for cover behind a massive fallen trunk. Jack was at his side in an instant, rifle already braced against his shoulder. Through his scope, Jack caught glimpses of movement in the canopy, dark figures shifting between branches, muzzle flashes illuminating their positions for split seconds. He squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. A figure tumbled from a platform 70 meters away, crashing through branches before hitting the jungle floor with a sickening thud. Hawk was on the radio, shouting coordinates over the deafening gunfire. "Multiple hostiles in elevated positions. Grid 505-729. Request immediate support." Walker's voice came back, barely audible above the chaos. "Negative on support. Fall back. To extraction point. Repeat, fall back immediately." A grenade exploded 15 meters to their right, sending shrapnel tearing through leaves and wood. Jack felt a sting across his cheek as a fragment grazed him, warm blood trickling down to his jaw. "We've got to move," Hawk yelled. "They're circling around." They broke cover simultaneously, running in a hunched sprint toward a cluster of dense foliage that offered better concealment. Bullets kicked up dirt at their feet, tore through leaves around their heads. Jack fired twice more as they ran, not aiming to kill but to suppress, to buy them precious seconds. They reached the new cover, breathing hard. Hawk's face was streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes were clear, focused. "They knew we were coming," he said between breaths. "This is a goddamn ambush." Jack nodded grimly. "We need to split up, create confusion." The words tasted bitter even as he said them. Every instinct screamed against separation, but tactically, it was their best chance. "Meet at the river bend, the one we passed 2 clicks back." Hawk's eyes met his, a moment of silent communication passing between them. They'd been through hell together over the past year, saved each other's lives more times than either could count. This wasn't the first impossible situation they'd faced. "Don't you die on me, Ghost," Hawk said, his usual humor absent. "You, neither," Jack replied. "On 3. 1, 2. The single shot cut through the air with a distinctive crack, different from the AKs. Precise, deliberate. Jack felt the spray of warm blood before he registered what had happened. Hawk's body jerked backward, a perfect hole appearing in the center of his forehead, eyes wide with shock that would never fade. "No!" The scream tore from Jack's throat involuntarily. He caught Hawk's body as it fell, lowering it to the ground even as bullets continued to rain around them. Blood poured from the wound, soaking into the jungle floor. Those clear eyes stared emptily at the canopy above. There was no time for grief, no time for proper goodbyes. The sniper who'd taken Hawk was still out there, still watching. With movements, automatic from years of training, Jack retrieved Hawk's dog tags and the map from his breast pocket. The radio was a shattered mess. It had taken a direct hit in the ambush. "I'm coming back for you," Jack whispered, a promise to the body of his friend. "I swear to God I'm coming back." Then he was moving, a ghost in the jungle, slipping between shadows with a cold, terrible purpose building in his chest. The enemy fire followed, but he was already gone, vanishing into the green hell that had claimed so many lives before him. An hour later, Jack crouched in the hollow of a massive banyan tree checking his remaining ammunition. 6 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 2 spare magazines in his pack. The wound on his cheek had stopped bleeding, crusting over in the humid air. His breathing had stabilized, but the emptiness beside him, the space where Hawk should be, felt like a physical wound. He removed his backup radio from his pack, a smaller unit with limited range. When he switched it on, static crackled quietly before Lieutenant Walker's voice cut through. "Repeat, Ghost. If you're receiving, fall back to extraction point Whiskey Niner. Recon mission is scrubbed. I say again, mission is scrubbed." Jack keyed the mic. "This is Ghost. Hawk is down. Confirmed KIA." The words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. "Request permission to continue mission." The response was immediate, decisive. "Negative, Ghost. Return to extraction point." "Immediately, that's an order." Jack closed his eyes, seeing again the perfect hole in Hawk's forehead. A professional shot. A sniper's shot. Not random fire, but a deliberate execution from a position he still hadn't identified. "Ghost, do you copy?" "Acknowledge order." Jack turned the radio off, returning it to his pack. The pain of loss was crystallizing inside him, hardening into something cold and sharp. A blade of pure intent. He wasn't leaving. Not until he found the sniper who'd killed Hawk. Not until he put a bullet through his skull with the same clinical precision. He checked his compass, orienting himself. The Viet Cong would be sweeping the area looking for survivors. They'd expect him to head toward the extraction point, toward safety. Instead, he would move deeper into their territory. He would become the hunter. The dense jungle canopy shifted above him, sunlight filtering through in broken patterns. Somewhere, in that green labyrinth, was a sniper, one skilled enough to take Hawk with a single shot. One who now had Jack in his sights. Ghost versus ghost. Hunter versus hunter. Jack chambered around and moved out, melting into the shadows. The jungle accepted him, swallowed him whole. He was no longer a Marine following orders. He was retribution itself, silent and inevitable as death. And the hunt had just begun. The jungle swallowed the sound of Jack's footfalls, dead leaves and soft earth yielding silently beneath his boots. 12 hours had passed since Hawk's death. 12 hours of methodical movement deeper into enemy territory. Guided by a cold rage that burned just beneath his skin, dawn filtered through the canopy in hazy columns of light. Jack crouched beside a narrow game trail, studying the subtle impressions in the mud. Boot prints, not the standard-issue American kind, but the distinctive tire tread pattern of Viet Cong footwear. 3 sets moving southwest, recent enough that the edges hadn't yet crumbled in the humid air. He traced a finger along the outline of one print, measuring its depth against his own. The man had been carrying something heavy, a radio perhaps, or extra ammunition. The thought sparked a memory of Hawk adjusting his radio pack, complaining about the weight even as he grinned that easy grin of his. Jack closed his eyes, forcing the image away. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford, not here, not now. He followed the tracks for nearly half a kilometer before they veered sharply east toward a dense cluster of banyan trees. Jack slowed his approach, scanning the canopy with practiced precision. The first rule of tracking a sniper, they always preferred elevation. The morning breeze shifted, carrying with it the acrid scent of spent gunpowder. Jack froze, becoming utterly still. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Someone had fired a weapon nearby, and recently. His eyes tracked upward, following the massive trunk of the largest banyan to its sprawling branches. There, 15 meters up, barely visible against the foliage, a platform, crude but effective, constructed from bamboo and camouflaged with fresh-cut branches. A sniper's nest. Jack circled the tree with glacial patience, keeping to cover, watching for any sign of movement. The platform appeared abandoned, but appearances in the jungle were as reliable as shadows. Twice he paused, sensing something. A presence, a watchfulness that raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck. Each time, a careful scan revealed nothing. The climb required exposing himself briefly, a calculated risk. Jack secured his rifle across his back and ascended with quiet efficiency, testing each handhold before committing his weight. The platform creaked softly as he pulled himself up. Blood, dried to a rusty brown, stained the bamboo slats. Empty. Cartridge casings lay scattered near the front edge, 7 in total. Jack collected one, examining the markings. Russian-made common VC ammunition, but the brass was clean, well-maintained. A professional's rounds, not the often corroded shells of a common guerrilla fighter. Beyond the blood and brass, Jack found something more valuable. A half-smoked cigarette, crushed out recently enough that the tobacco was still damp. Not an American brand. The filter bore the distinctive yellow staining of Vietnamese tobacco. Jack's nostrils flared as he inhaled its scent, committing it to memory. Through his scope, he surveyed the surrounding jungle. From this vantage point, he could see the clearing where Hawk had fallen, a perfect shot from an almost impossible angle, through gaps in the canopy that only a master sniper would attempt. That's when he saw the first anomaly, a broken branch, 70 meters northwest. Deliberate, not natural, a marker. Another appeared in his scope, 80 meters beyond the first. Jack lowered the rifle, understanding dawning like a cold stone in his gut. These weren't random signs. They were a trail, set specifically at intervals matching the effective range of a sniper rifle. He was being led. Jack descended from the platform with renewed caution, every sense heightened to painful acuity. The jungle seemed different now, watchful, predatory. He'd operated in these conditions for 18 months, but never had he felt so exposed, so hunted. Moving toward the first marker, Jack kept low, using the undergrowth for concealment. He'd abandoned the direct tracking of footprints, focusing instead on the more subtle signs: a disturbed patch of moss, a freshly broken spider web, the unnatural silence of birds in an otherwise noisy section of jungle. The second marker, another deliberately broken branch, led to a small clearing where the ground had been recently disturbed. Jack approached with extreme caution, scanning the trees before examining what had been left for him to find. A single, spent cartridge, placed precisely in the center of the cleared space. Beside it lay a playing card, soaked through with jungle moisture, but still legible. The ace of spades, the death card, the calling card American soldiers often left on their kills. Jack's jaw tightened. The message was clear. He wasn't the only one hunting. A twig snapped somewhere to his left, too deliberate, too perfectly timed to be accidental. Jack dropped to the ground instantly, pressing himself into the earth as the supersonic crack of a bullet split the air precisely where he'd been standing. The report followed a fraction of a second later. A high-powered rifle at least 200 meters distant. The shot hadn't been meant to kill. It had been meant to announce. Sweat beaded on Jack's forehead as he remained perfectly still, controlling, his breathing becoming part of the jungle floor. 1 minute passed, then 5. No movement, no sound beyond the normal chorus of insects and distant birds. With painstaking slowness, Jack crawled backward, using a fallen log for cover before finally daring to rise to a crouch. The shooter was gone, or rather, had relocated. That was the way of it with snipers. Fire and move. Never stay in one position for a follow-up shot. It was exactly what Jack would have done. He spent the next 3 hours in a careful counter-tracking pattern, moving in concentric circles from the point of fire, searching for any trace of his would-be killer. He found nothing. No footprints, no disturbances, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the sniper had materialized just long enough to take the shot, then vanished back into the ether. As dusk approached, Jack selected a defensive position in the hollow of a massive fallen tree, its interior carved out by rot and insects. It offered a natural bunker, with clear sightlines to the surrounding jungle, but minimal exposure. He would not risk a fire, despite the growing chill. He retrieved his backup radio, adjusting the frequency to monitor enemy communications. Most were in Vietnamese, indecipherable to him, but occasionally the Viet Cong used captured American equipment with English-speaking operators. It was a long shot, but information was as valuable as ammunition in this fight. An hour of static passed before voices crackled through. Vietnamese, fast, and urgent. Among the unintelligible words, Jack caught what sounded like Marine and sniper. They were talking about him. His pulse quickened as he adjusted the frequency slightly, trying to improve the reception. Then, amid the garbled transmission, 3 English words came through with chilling clarity. The whisper comes. The transmission ended. Jack sat motionless in the growing darkness, turning the phrase over in his mind. Not a code name he'd heard before, but the reverence in the speaker's tone conveyed its significance. A local legend, perhaps. A ghost story, to frighten American troops. Or the call sign of the sniper who had killed Hawk. Night fell completely, transforming the jungle into a negative of itself. Deeper shadows within shadow, punctuated by the occasional bioluminescent fungus or flashing firefly. Jack didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of a nightbird might be a signal, a movement, a threat. The darkness played tricks on his eyes. Twice he jerked his rifle up, certain he'd seen a figure moving between the trees, only to find nothing when he peered through his scope. The third time he caught a fleeting glimpse of something, or someone moving with deliberate grace, there and gone before he could draw a bead. Paranoia crept in like the damp jungle cold. Jack found himself doubting his own senses, questioning shadows he'd have dismissed hours earlier. Was that dark patch against the tree trunk a soldier or merely deeper darkness? Had that rustling been a jungle animal or a boot carefully placed? By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Jack's nerves were frayed to breaking. But something else had crystallized within him, an awareness, an awakening of instincts long dormant. He was beginning to recognize patterns in the seemingly random sounds of the jungle. The artificial silence that followed a human passage. The subtle rhythm of deliberate movement versus natural disturbance. He was learning to think like his hunter. With the first gray light of dawn, Jack left his shelter, moving with renewed purpose. He'd abandoned his original mission. The Viet Cong battalion no longer mattered, nor did the extraction point where Lieutenant Walker would be waiting. There was only the hunt now, him and the whisper, locked in a deadly game of patience and skill. But as he navigated the shadowy spaces between massive tree trunks, a new realization settled over him. This was no longer just his hunt. The playing card, the deliberately missed shot, the trail of markers. These weren't the actions of someone merely defending territory. They were invitations, challenges. The whisper wasn't just hunting him. The whisper was testing him. Jack paused beside a small stream, using its gurgle to mask the sound as he checked his weapon and remaining ammunition. 5 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 1 spare magazine with 7 more. 13 shots to find and eliminate. A sniper who already knew his position, his movements, possibly even his patterns. A nearly impossible task for most men. But Jack Merritt wasn't most men. In the mountains of Montana, his father had taught him to track elk through forests so dense you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. It ain't about seeing the animal, his father had said. It's about seeing the world the way the animal sees it. You want to find him, you got to think like him. Jack submerged his hands in the cool stream, washing the grime from his face. The grief for Hawk remained, but it had transmuted into something colder, more focused, a sniper's calm. He would not be led any further. He would not be the one studied and predicted. It was time to change the game. He removed his dog tags, tucking them into a secure pocket. If the whisper was studying him as a hunter studies prey, then Jack would need to become something else entirely. Not a Marine sniper with identifiable tactics and training. Not even Jack Merritt. He would need to become a ghost. Jack stood, water dripping from his face, his eyes scanning the canopy above. Somewhere out there, the whisper was watching, waiting, measuring his next move. "All right," Jack whispered to the silent trees. "Let's see how well you track a ghost." The jungle seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the challenge. And in the distance, almost imperceptible against the growing chorus of morning birds, came the soft sound of a single twig breaking, exactly like the one that had preceded yesterday's warning shot. It wasn't coincidence. It was response. The hunt was on. The pre-dawn mist clung to the jungle floor like a spectral blanket, obscuring the deadly game of chess Jack had been orchestrating since first light. Crouched motionless in the hollow of a massive banyan tree, he surveyed his handiwork through narrowed eyes. 300 meters northeast, his boonie hat, positioned on a branch to appear like a man in hiding. 200 meters due west, his canteen, deliberately placed to catch the morning sun, and directly before him 50 meters out, a simple trap of disturbed vegetation and a single boot print pressed deliberately into soft mud. Decoys, distractions, invitations to fire. 6 hours had passed since he'd set his ambush. 6 hours of absolute stillness, of controlling his breathing until it matched the rhythm of the jungle itself. His muscles screamed in protest, but he'd endured worse in sniper school. The first lesson they taught, patience outlasts pain. The mist began to burn away as morning heat intensified, revealing the vibrant greens and browns of the jungle in patches. Like a photograph slowly developing, Jack remained utterly still, his rifle trained on the most likely approach vector. The whisper would come. He had to come. Another hour crawled by. Sweat trickled down Jack's spine, pooling at the small of his back. A mosquito landed on his neck, its proboscis piercing skin. He let it feed. Movement meant death. The rustle came from his far right, subtle but distinct from the natural sounds he'd cataloged through the night. A deliberate movement. Jack's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger, but he kept his eyes forward. Misdirection. The oldest trick. The second rustle came from the same direction. Louder. Too loud. Decoy. Jack pivoted at the last possible second, swinging his rifle toward the true threat, a shadow of movement to his left where the jungle was densest. He fired once, the crack of his M40 shattering the morning stillness. Birds erupted from the canopy in a panic of wings and cries. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Jack remained frozen, scanning for any sign of a hit. Nothing. No sound of impact. No cry of pain. Just the oppressive stillness of the jungle closing back around him. The answering shot came without warning, a supersonic crack and the deadly whisper of a bullet passing inches from his left ear. Bark exploded from the tree beside his head, wood fragments stinging his cheek. Jack was already moving, rolling from his position as a second shot splintered the ground where he'd been crouched. The whisper had anticipated his ambush, had waited for Jack to reveal himself. Using the dense undergrowth for cover, Jack scrambled in a low crouch, moving perpendicular to the shooter's position. No third shot came. The Viet Cong sniper would be relocating already, following the same doctrine that Jack himself had been trained in. Never fire twice from the same position. He made it 50 meters before stopping behind a fallen tree, chest, heaving not from exertion but from the cold realization. The whisper had outplayed him completely, had used Jack's own strategy against him, with a patience that bordered on supernatural. This wasn't an ordinary enemy. This was someone who understood the very nature of the hunt. Jack closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing his heart rate to slow. When he opened them again, he noticed something that hadn't been there moments before. A small pile of spent cartridges, carefully arranged at the base of a nearby tree. 7 brass casings meticulously stacked in a pyramid, and beside them a second playing card. The ace of spades again, but this time with a crude hourglass drawn on its face in what looked like blood. Time running out. The message couldn't have been clearer. The whisper was toying with him, communicating in the universal language of predator and prey, and Jack had been categorized as the latter. He left the cartridges undisturbed but took the card, tucking it into his breast pocket alongside Hawk's dog tags. The psychological game cut both ways. If the whisper wanted to crawl inside his head, Jack would return the favor. The remainder of the morning passed in tense movement. Jack abandoned traditional evasion tactics, instead employing the methods his father had taught him for moving through Montana's dense forests, following streams where the sound of water would mask his footfalls, using animal trails where the ground was already packed hard, doubling back and circling to confuse his trail. Twice he detected signs of pursuit. A too-still section of forest where birds had been frightened into silence, a barely perceptible impression in soft earth that hadn't been there during his pass. The whisper was good, practically a phantom, but even phantoms displaced air when they moved. By midday, the humidity had reached suffocating levels. The jungle canopy trapped heat like a greenhouse, turning the air thick enough to chew. Jack's fatigues were soaked through with sweat. His lips, cracked from dehydration, he paused at a small stream, listening intently before kneeling to refill his canteen. The water felt like salvation against his parched throat. He was securing the canteen cap when he noticed it, a patch of disturbed moss on a tree trunk directly across the stream. Fresh disturbance, the green still bright where it had been turned over. Someone had pressed against that tree, and recently. Jack scanned the surrounding area with renewed focus. 20 meters upstream, another sign, a broken fern, its stem still leaking milky sap. And beyond that, barely visible, a boot print in the soft bank. Too obvious. The whisper was too skilled for such elementary mistakes. Another trap. Jack backed, away from the stream, choosing a different route entirely, straight up. Using the massive, gnarled roots of a banyan tree as a natural ladder, he climbed 15 feet to a sturdy branch, then traversed to an adjacent tree, moving horizontally through the middle canopy. The new perspective revealed what he'd missed. From ground level, a carefully prepared position overlooking the stream, a nest of bent branches that would have concealed a waiting sniper perfectly. Had Jack followed the trail of sign, he would have walked directly into the whisper's sights. He was adapting, learning, but so was his opponent. Dark clouds gathered throughout the afternoon, the air growing heavier with the promise of rain. Jack used the time to establish a defensive position in the upper story of the jungle, a natural platform where 3 massive branches intersected. From this vantage point, he could observe a wide section of the surrounding territory without exposing himself. The storm broke with tropical suddenness. One moment pregnant anticipation, the next a deluge. Rain hammered down in solid sheets, transforming the canopy into a cacophony of dripping leaves and swaying branches. Visibility dropped to near zero beyond 20 meters. The rain was both blessing and curse. It obscured movement but also erased sign. It dampened sound but also created a constant background noise that could mask approach. Jack used the opportunity to rehydrate, catching rainwater in his canteen and in cupped hands, drinking until his stomach felt distended. A flash of lightning illuminated the jungle in stark white, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Pia, that split second of brilliance, Jack caught a glimpse of something that froze the water in his throat. A figure moving with deliberate grace between trees not 100 meters distant. Just a silhouette there and gone, but undeniably human, undeniably hunting. The whisper. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. The range was extreme for these conditions, the target momentary, no shot worth taking. But now he knew. His opponent was close, circling, waiting for an opening. The storm continued through the evening and into true darkness, finally subsiding around midnight to leave a jungle dripping and renewed. Jack hadn't moved from his position, hadn't so much as shifted his weight except to prevent muscle cramping. The night vision scope he'd salvaged from Hawk's rifle allowed him to monitor the surrounding area in shades of ghostly green, every water droplet a tiny beacon in the darkness. Nothing moved but night creatures and swaying branches. Dawn approached, with maddening slowness, the eastern sky lightening from black to deepest purple. Jack blinked away fatigue, focusing on the primitive campsite he'd established as another decoy. His poncho stretched between branches, appearing from a distance like a hasty shelter. Beneath it, his rucksack, arranged to suggest a sleeping figure. The shot that destroyed the decoy came precisely at first light, a single crack that pulverized the rucksack, sending fragments of cloth and equipment raining down. Jack triangulated the shot's origin instantly, a rocky outcropping 200 meters to the southeast. Without hesitation, he pivoted and fired twice in rapid succession at the position, then immediately changed his own location, sliding down from his perch via a hanging vine to land in a controlled crouch on the forest floor. No return fire came. The Whisper would have relocated already, assuming Jack had survived the decoy's destruction. Moving with swift care, Jack circled toward the outcropping, approaching from downwind. The position was expertly chosen, elevated, with multiple escape routes and clear lines of sight to the decoy, the kind of spot Jack himself would have selected. The only sign of the Whisper's presence was a small pile of earth freshly disturbed at the base of the outcropping, a shallow depression where a man might have lain in wait. Beside it, a third playing card. Not the ace of spades this time, but the king of hearts, the suicide king, his sword piercing his own head, and written across the card in dark fluid, "Worthy." Jack stared at the message, something shifting in his chest. Not the burning rage that had driven him since Hawk's death, but something colder, more focused. Recognition, understanding. In another life, under different circumstances, the Whisper might have been a brother in arms rather than an enemy. They spoke the same language, not Vietnamese or English, but the silent dialect of hunters, of men who had mastered the art of dealing death from the shadows. Jack tucked the card away with the others. The game had changed. This was no longer merely about vengeance for Hawk. It had become something more primal, a contest between equals, a test of will as much as skill. For the first time since entering the jungle, Jack smiled, a razor-thin curving of lips that held no humor, only determination. "All right," he whispered to the watching trees. "Let's finish this dance." He moved out, heading deeper into enemy territory rather than retreating. If the Whisper wanted to test him, wanted to find him worthy, then Jack would oblige. But he would do it on his terms now. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lone sniper's greatest asset wasn't his rifle or his camouflage, or even his skill. It was his patience. His willingness to become an extension of the environment, to surrender individuality and merge with the killing ground until predator and terrain became indistinguishable. Jack didn't just need to outshoot the Whisper. He needed to outthink him to understand the patterns of thought that guided his enemy's movements. To see the jungle not through American eyes, but through the eyes of a man who had been born to, its rhythms who had become its silent ghost. As the sun climbed higher, Jack felt a strange calm settle over him. The lonely clarity of a man who had accepted the terms of his own possible death. There were worse ways to die than at the hands of a worthy opponent. Hawk, at least, had been granted that dignity. But Jack had no intention of dying. Not today. Not in this jungle. He glanced at the slanting rays of sunlight piercing the canopy, gauging the time, mid-morning. The day still young, still full of possibility. Somewhere ahead lay the Whisper's domain, the heart of enemy territory. And there, Jack would find not just his opponent, but the truth of what kind of hunter he himself had become in these blood-soaked forests. He checked his ammunition last time. 4 rounds remaining in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 7 in reserve. 12 chances to end a dance of death that had begun with Hawk's murder. It would be enough. It had to be enough. Jack moved forward, a ghost among shadows, his grief transformed into cold purpose. The jungle watched, indifferent to the drama playing out beneath its ancient canopy. One man hunting another, bound together in the oldest ritual known to humanity. Only one would walk away. The third day in the jungle had taken its toll. Jack's right arm bore a long, shallow gash where a bullet had creased flesh without penetrating, a warning shot from the Whisper that could have been fatal had his opponent truly desired it. His left ankle throbbed from a misstep into a hidden depression, not broken but badly twisted. Exhaustion had settled into his bones like lead weights, and the constant vigilance had frayed his nerves to near breaking. Still, he pushed forward, deeper into territory no American patrol had mapped. The vegetation had changed subtly over the past kilometers, the massive banyans giving way to denser stands of bamboo and shorter, scrubby undergrowth. The ground rose in gentle slopes, hinting at the foothills that eventually became mountains near the Laotian border. Jack moved with painful slowness, testing each step, scanning constantly for the telltale signs of enemy presence. He paused, at midday, to dress his arm wound, tearing a strip from his already tattered undershirt to bind the injury. The humid air made everything stick, cloth to skin, skin to equipment. His canteen was nearly empty again, forcing him to listen for the sound of running water as he navigated the increasingly unfamiliar terrain. A distant bird call broke the pattern of jungle sounds, 3 notes too rhythmic to be natural. Jack froze, recognizing the sound for what it was, a signal. He sank slowly to the ground, becoming part of the undergrowth as his eyes tracked the direction of the call. There it was again, answered by another from the opposite direction. Not birds, men, communicating. Jack's pulse quickened. After days of playing cat and mouse with a phantom, he'd stumbled upon something concrete. Actual VC presence, not just the ghostly passage of the whisper. He began to move toward the sound with painful care, every sense heightened to breaking. The smells reached him first: wood smoke, fish cooking, the distinctive sweet-sour scent of fermented nuoc mam sauce. Then came snatches of voices, too distant to make out words but unmistakably human. Jack adjusted his course, using a dense stand of bamboo for cover as he approached. What he found nearly stopped his heart. A clearing opened before him, not natural but man-made. Trees felled and undergrowth cleared to create a space perhaps 100 meters across. Within it stood a Viet Cong encampment of substantial size. Not just a temporary bivouac, but a semi-permanent base. Bamboo structures rose on stilts above the jungle floor, their thatched roofs blending perfectly with the canopy above. Jack counted at least 15 distinct buildings, with smaller shelters and cooking areas scattered between. And men, dozens, of Viet Cong soldiers moving with purpose through the camp. Some cleaned weapons, others prepared food or mended equipment. A larger structure in the center appeared to serve as a command post, with guards positioned at its entrance. Radio antennas rose from its roof, carefully camouflaged but visible to Jack's trained eye. This wasn't just an outpost. This was a full battalion headquarters. Jack eased himself into a prone position behind a fallen log, setting up his observation post with methodical care. His scope allowed him to study the camp's layout, mentally mapping entry and exit points, guard positions, and the rhythm of activity. Hours passed as he documented the camp, shifting position minutely to avoid muscle cramps. The activities below followed predictable patterns: guard rotations, meal preparations, equipment maintenance. But something was off. The VC soldiers moved with a strange tension, their gestures clipped, their postures too straight. They weren't relaxed despite being deep in their own territory. They were waiting for something, or someone. As dusk approached, Jack noticed a subtle shift in the camp's energy. The guard positions doubled. Cooking fires were banked. Conversations ceased. A tangible anticipation hung in the air, so thick Jack could almost taste it from his hidden perch. Then came the bird call again, the same 3-note signal, but from directly east of the camp. The reaction below was immediate. The commanding officer emerged from the central structure, flanked by aides. Soldiers formed loose ranks, not for inspection, but for greeting. Jack adjusted his scope, focusing on the eastern edge of the clearing. For long minutes, nothing moved. Then, like a mirage resolving into reality, a figure emerged from the tree line. Even at a distance, Jack knew instantly. The whisper. The VC sniper moved with fluid grace, a shadow coming to life. Taller than most Vietnamese, with a lean, almost skeletal build, he wore no uniform, only black pajama-style pants and a dark, close-fitting jacket that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. His face was obscured by a traditional non-lay conical hat, tilted low. But it was neither his appearance nor his movement that confirmed his identity. It was the reaction of the soldiers. They parted before him like water around a stone, heads bowing slightly as he passed. No salutes were exchanged, no formal military courtesies. The deference shown was something deeper, more primal. The kind of respect granted to something not quite human. The commanding officer bowed his head as the whisper approached, speaking rapid Vietnamese. Jack couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, reverence tinged with fear. The whisper responded with minimal gestures, his voice too low to carry to Jack's position. What followed was extraordinary, rather than entering. The command structure. The whisper was escorted to a separate building, smaller than the command post but more carefully constructed. 2 guards took position at its entrance after he disappeared inside, their posture suggesting not security but tribute. He wasn't just a sniper. He was their spiritual guardian, their living ghost. Jack's mind raced as he processed this new information. The whisper wasn't operating alone, wasn't just a lone hunter tracking him through the jungle. He had an entire battalion at his disposal, eyes and ears throughout the territory, resources, intelligence. The game had been rigged from the start. Yet the whisper had chosen to hunt Jack personally, one-on-one, had tested him, marked him as worthy. Why? The darkness deepened as Jack continued his observation, the camp below transforming in the falling night. Fires were lit, casting orange glows against the structures. Guards moved with infrared flashlights, invisible to the naked eye but clear beacons through Jack's nightscope. The perimeter security was impressive, overlapping fields of fire, regular patrols, elevated watch positions. Getting out would be nearly impossible. Getting a shot at the whisper even more so. Yet there he was, the ghost himself, emerging from his private quarters as the moon rose. His rifle, a Dragunov SVD with custom modifications, hung casually from one shoulder. He moved to the center of the camp, where officers had gathered around a crude table bearing maps and papers. Jack's crosshairs settled on the whisper's chest. Range, approximately 350 meters. Conditions, slight breeze from the west, 5 knots. Temperature, 84 degrees. Elevation, minimal factor. A difficult shot, but not impossible. His finger tightened on the trigger. One squeeze and Hawk would be avenged. The whisper would fall, and Jack could die knowing he'd completed his mission. But as the crosshairs steadied, the whisper did something unexpected. He lifted his head and looked directly toward Jack's position, not scanning, not searching, but staring with pinpoint accuracy at the very log behind which Jack lay hidden. Then, slowly, deliberately, the whisper raised his hand in what could only be described as a salute. He knew. He had known all along. Something cold slithered down Jack's spine. This wasn't a hunt. It was a game, with rules he didn't fully understand. And if he took the shot now, he would be changing those rules irrevocably. But Hawk's face flashed in his memory, the shocked stillness of death, the perfect bullet hole in his forehead. Rules or not, the whisper had to answer for that. Jack exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Adjusted for wind, squeezed. The rifle's report shattered the jungle night. Through his scope, Jack saw the impact, not on the whisper who had moved with impossible speed, but on the table beside him. Maps exploded into confetti, officers scattered, and the camp erupted into chaos. Jack was already moving, knowing his position was compromised. He rolled away from his perch as the first return fire chewed into the log he'd been hiding behind. AK-47 fire, dozens of weapons discharging at once, turning the jungle around him into a blender of splinters and shredded vegetation. He had seconds, not minutes, to escape. Abandoning stealth for speed, Jack crashed through the underbrush, zigzagging to avoid presenting a clean target. Bullets whined past his ears, thudded into trees around him. A burning sensation across his left side told him he'd been grazed again, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. Jack plunged down a steep embankment he hadn't noticed during his approach. tumbling through vegetation before landing hard at the bottom. The impact drove the air from his lungs, left him momentarily stunned. Above, muzzle flashes illuminated the ridgeline as VC soldiers pursued, shouting to each other in rapid Vietnamese. He forced himself up, ignoring the protests of his battered body. His rifle was gone, lost in the tumble down the slope. Only his sidearm remained, an M1911 with a single magazine, 7 rounds, against an entire battalion. Jack moved along the base of the embankment, keeping the ridge between himself and his pursuers. The sounds of the search intensified. More voices, the crash of men moving through jungle, the occasional burst of automatic fire. No precision now, just brute force pursuit. The ground beneath his feet suddenly gave way to water. A narrow stream, moving fast enough to mask sound. Jack waded in immediately, using the current to carry him downstream while obscuring his trail. The cold water shocked his system, simultaneously numbing the pain of his injuries and reviving his fading alertness. He traveled nearly a kilometer by water before hauling himself onto the opposite bank, fighting the current to exit at a rocky outcropping that would leave minimal sign. The pursuing sounds had faded to distant echoes, but Jack took no comfort in that. They would have trackers, dogs perhaps, and they had the Whisper, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to know Jack's movements. Finding a hollow beneath a fallen tree, Jack collapsed into momentary shelter. Blood soaked the left side of his fatigues. The bullet grazed deeper than he'd initially assessed. His ankle throbbed with renewed intensity after the rough escape. Worse, his pack was gone, lost somewhere in the frantic flight. No food, no medical supplies, no spare ammunition. Reality crashed down upon him like a physical weight. He was deep in enemy territory, wounded, with minimal weapons and no support. The Whisper had an entire battalion at his disposal, knew the territory intimately, and had already demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate Jack's every move. This wasn't a mission anymore. It wasn't even a hunt. It was suicide. For the first time since Hawk's death, doubt crept into Jack's mind. Was vengeance worth this? Worth dying in an unmarked jungle? His body never recovered, his death serving no strategic purpose? Hawk was gone. No amount of spilled blood would bring him back. A sound interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Water droplets falling onto leaves, with unnatural rhythm. Jack stiffened, hand moving to his sidearm. The pattern continued, moving closer. Deliberate. A signal. In the moonlight filtering through the canopy, Jack saw it. A playing card pinned to a tree trunk with a bamboo sliver. Not 10 meters from his position. Impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. The Whisper had found him. Again. Jack's hand tightened on his pistol, though he knew it was futile. If the Whisper wanted him dead, he already would be. This was something else. Another move in their deadly game. He approached the card cautiously, watching for tripwires or other traps. None appeared. The card was the ace of spades again, but this time something was written across its face in meticulous handwriting. The hunter honors worthy prey by offering a clean death. The ghost offers the same to his brother ghost. Dawn, the high ground. One shot. It was an invitation, a challenge, a promise. Jack removed the card, his mind racing. The high ground could only refer to one feature he'd observed during his approach to the camp. A distinctive hill that rose above the surrounding jungle, perhaps 2 kilometers south of his current position. A natural sniper's paradise with clear, sight lines in all directions. The Whisper was offering a final confrontation. One sniper against another. No battalion backup, no elaborate traps. Just skill against skill, will against will. It could be another trap. Probably was. But something in Jack rebelled against the idea of running, of abandoning the hunt when his prey had offered such a direct challenge. This had transcended vengeance, had become something more primal, more personal. Jack sank back against the tree, suddenly aware of how utterly exhausted he was. His eyelids felt weighted, his limbs leaden. The various injuries and the constant vigilance of the past 3 days had drained him completely. If he was to have any chance at dawn, he needed rest. needed to recoup some measure of strength, but could he afford to sleep? With the whisper still hunting him, the question became moot as unconsciousness claimed him, his body overriding his mind's desperate warnings. His last conscious thought was of Hawk's face, not in death, but in life, laughing at some joke shared during a rare moment of peace. Wondering if he'd see that laugh again soon. Jack dreamt of Montana, of snow-capped mountains and clear, cold streams, of his father teaching him to track, to hunt, to survive. "The land doesn't care if you live or die, son," his father had said. "It's neutral. Learn its language and it helps you. Ignore it, and it kills you." He awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. The jungle darkness surrounded him, but the quality of the air had changed. Pre-dawn. He'd slept for hours, completely vulnerable, yet he still lived. More messages from the whisper, more rules to their deadly game. Jack checked his injuries, in the growing light. The bullet graze along his side had stopped bleeding, though it pulled painfully as he moved. His ankle supported weight, if barely. He still had his sidearm with its 7 rounds. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, but perhaps enough for one perfect shot. If he chose to accept the whisper's challenge. Logic dictated retreat. Every Marine instinct hammered into him during training screamed to fall back, to seek extraction, to live to fight another day. There was an entire war happening beyond this personal vendetta. Men dying on both sides for causes greater than one man's need for revenge. But as the eastern sky lightened, Jack found himself moving south, toward the high ground, toward the whisper. His decision made not by logic or training, but by something deeper, more fundamental to his nature. If he was to die, it would be on his feet, facing his enemy. As a sniper, as a ghost. The hill appeared through the thinning jungle as the first true light of dawn broke above the canopy. A natural prominence rising perhaps 100 feet above the surrounding terrain, its rocky crown offering the perfect vantage point for miles in every direction. No cover on the approach, no place to hide during the ascent. A killing ground designed by nature for exactly this moment. Jack surveyed it from the tree line, noting the most likely position the whisper would take. A rock formation near the summit that offered both elevation and shadow. If their positions were reversed, that's where Jack would set up, which meant he needed to approach from the blind side, the steeper eastern face that would keep the morning sun at his back. He began his ascent as birds announced the new day with raucous calls. Each step was agony for his injured ankle, each movement a test of will against the pain in his side. But step by step, he climbed, not rushing, not hesitating, moving with the inexorable purpose of a man who had accepted whatever waited at the top. Halfway up, a glint of metal caught his eye, a spent cartridge placed purposefully on a flat stone. Beside it, another playing card. The Suicide King again, but this time the message was different. The ghosts meet. Only one returns to the world of men. Jack tucked the card away with the others. The rules were clear now. This was no longer about the war, about America versus Vietnam, about politics or ideology. This was about 2 hunters who had recognized in each other something rare, something worthy of respect even as they sought each other's death. The final test, the final shot. Jack continued his climb, his resolve hardening with each step. If he couldn't outshoot the whisper, he would outthink him. If he couldn't outthink him, he would outlast him. Whatever it took to honor Hawk's memory, to complete the hunt he'd begun 3 days and a lifetime ago. The summit waited, bathed in the gold of morning light, and somewhere among the rocks the whisper watched, patient as the jungle itself, ready for their final confrontation. One shot, one ghost, one ending to their deadly dance. Jack didn't go to the hilltop. As dawn broke fully, casting long shadows, across the jungle floor he watched the rocky summit from the concealment of a dense thicket half a kilometer away. His father's words echoed in his mind. The moment you play by another man's rules, you've already lost. The whisper had dictated every movement of their deadly dance thus far. The invitations, the psychological warfare, the controlled encounters, all designed to funnel Jack exactly where the whisper wanted him. The hill was no different, a perfect killing ground where Jack would be exposed during his ascent, channeled into predictable approaches, forced to fight on terms not his own, so he broke the rules. Instead of climbing to meet his fate, Jack retreated deeper into the jungle, not fleeing but redefining the battlefield. The Whisper wanted a final confrontation, a climactic duel between equals. Jack would give him one, but on his terms, not the Whisper's. First, he needed resources. Operating with just a sidearm and no supplies was suicide. Jack moved southwest, following game trails until he found what he was searching for, signs of recent VC movement. A patrol had passed this way within hours, their boot prints still fresh in the soft earth. He tracked them cautiously, keeping to parallel routes rather than following directly in their path. The trail led to a small clearing where 3 VC soldiers had established a listening post. Jack observed them from the tree line, 2 sleeping while 1 kept watch, their weapons stacked neatly beside a small, smokeless fire. No longer a Marine following rules of engagement, Jack struck with cold efficiency. The sentry died silently, Jack's combat knife severing his carotid artery before he could cry out. The sleeping men never woke, their throats cut with the same clinical precision. Jack felt nothing as he worked, no satisfaction, no remorse. Just a detached awareness that every action was necessary for survival. He appropriated their equipment methodically, an AK-47 with 4 magazines, 2 grenades, a wooden-handled machete, and most precious of all, a canteen of fresh water and a packet of rice. Their radio he disabled rather than took, removing key components and burying them separately. Dressed in his blood-soaked fatigues, face streaked with mud, armed with enemy weapons, Jack Merritt had completed a transformation begun days ago in the moment of Hawk's death. He was no longer merely a Marine sniper. He had become something the Viet Cong themselves would recognize and fear. A forest ghost, a Ma Rung, neither fully alive nor dead, existing in the shadow realm between worlds. With renewed purpose, Jack began the first phase of his plan. Using the machete, he blazed an obvious trail heading northeast. Large broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, even a dropped AK magazine with several rounds spilled onto the ground. A trail so clear that even an amateur tracker would recognize it instantly. Too clear. A diversion. The real trail he laid with painstaking subtlety, heading west, then curving south, using streams to mask his passage, stepping only on rock or fallen logs, leaving signs so faint that only a master tracker would detect them. Signs meant specifically for the Whisper. By midday, he'd circled back toward the Viet Cong camp, approaching from the west rather than the east, where they would expect pursuit to come from. The battalions would be searching outward, not watching their own perimeter. Jack took position, in a tree overlooking the western edge of the camp, observing patrol patterns and guard rotations. The chaos from the previous night had subsided, but the camp remained on high alert. Twice as many guards patrolled the perimeter, and squads regularly departed, presumably to search for him. Jack waited, conserving his strength, watching with predatory patience. Late afternoon brought what he'd been waiting for, a disruption in the camp's routine as a patrol returned empty-handed. Officers gathered, gesturing in frustration, and then, emerging from his separate quarters, the Whisper. Even at this distance, Jack could sense his irritation in the clipped movements, the tense posture. The hunter disliked losing track of his prey. Jack smiled grimly. Phase 1 complete. Now for Phase 2. He retreated from his observation post as dusk approached, moving through lengthening shadows to the northern perimeter of the camp. Here the vegetation grew particularly dense, a thicket of bamboo and thorny underbrush that the VC had left as a natural barrier. Through this tangle ran a narrow trail used by perimeter guards during their rotation. Jack worked methodically in the growing darkness, setting the first of his traps. He positioned one of the grenades as a modified tripwire, concealing it in the undergrowth beside the trail. Not designed to kill, but to create chaos, to make the VC believe they were under attack from the north. The second trap was more elaborate. Using techniques learned from Montagnard tribesmen who had fought alongside American forces, Jack constructed a series of harmless but startling noise traps arrangements of dry bamboo that would snap and crack when disturbed, mimicking the sound of movement through the underbrush. He placed these in a curved pattern leading from the eastern perimeter toward the south. His final preparation was the most dangerous. Returning to the western edge of the camp, Jack located a VC punji trap, a concealed pit lined with sharpened bamboo stakes smeared with excrement. Instead of avoiding it, he carefully disarmed and then rearmed it, extending the covered portion of the pit to encroach further onto what appeared to be safe ground. Anyone pursuing along this route would be channeled directly into the hidden spikes. By midnight, Jack's preparations were complete. He took position in a massive banyan tree overlooking the southern edge of the clearing, settling into the natural cradle formed by its massive branches. From here, he could observe the entire camp while maintaining multiple escape routes. Then he waited. Sleep came in microbursts, the combat napping technique taught to recon Marines. 20 minutes of deep sleep followed by full alertness, repeated through the night. By dawn, he was rested enough for what would come next. The morning patrol departed as expected, small squads fanning out in different directions. Jack allowed them to pass beneath his position, unmolested. His target wasn't ordinary soldiers. His quarry was the ghost himself. An hour after sunrise, Jack initiated Phase 3. Aiming carefully, he fired a single shot from the captured AK-47 toward the northern perimeter. Not at any personnel, but into the air. The report echoed through the jungle, startling birds into flight. The reaction was immediate. Guards swiveled toward the northern edge, weapons raised. Officers emerged from the command post, shouting orders. The camp transformed from relative calm to combat readiness in seconds, exactly as the grenade detonated. The explosion tore through the northern thicket, sending vegetation and earth skyward. Confusion erupted as VC soldiers rushed toward the blast, assuming an attack from that direction. Jack was already moving, descending rapidly from his perch and circling southeast, paralleling the camp's edge without approaching it directly. Finding another suitable tree, he climbed quickly, ignoring the protest of his injured ankle. Once, in position, he fired again, 2 shots this time, aimed at nothing, designed only to create the impression of an attacker moving to the eastern perimeter. The pattern continued for hours. Jack would fire from one position, trigger one of his noise traps, then disappear before pursuit could find him. He never engaged directly, never presented a target. Like a ghost, he appeared in sound only to vanish before being seen. By mid-afternoon, the VC battalion was scattered, disorganized, jumping at shadows. Patrols had been dispatched in multiple directions, thinning the camp's defenses. Officers could be heard shouting in frustration, unable to locate an enemy that seemed to materialize and disappear at will. Jack observed it all from varying vantage points, conserving ammunition, waiting for the real target to emerge. The Whisper had remained conspicuously absent throughout the chaos, staying within his private quarters as the camp disintegrated into confusion around him. Until finally he appeared. The Whisper emerged with cold fury evident in every line of his body. He crossed the central clearing, berating officers, gesturing sharply at the surrounding jungle. His message was clear even without understanding the words. The hunt had been his domain, his responsibility. Now it was being taken from him. Through his improvised bamboo scope, Jack studied his opponent properly for the first time. The Whisper was indeed taller than most Vietnamese, with a whipcord leanness that spoke of hardship and relentless conditioning. His face, visible now without the conical hat, bore a jagged scar from left temple to jaw, likely from napalm, given its distinctive pattern. His eyes were what struck Jack most. Dark, yes, but lit with an inner intensity that bordered on fanaticism. Eyes Jack had seen before, in his own reflection during his darkest moments in the jungle. The Whisper gestured toward the southern perimeter, Jack's current direction, and began barking orders. He'd figured out the pattern. Of course he had. He was gathering men for a coordinated sweep, intending to drive Jack into prepared positions. Time for the final phase. Jack descended and began moving west, circling wide around the camp before cutting north. The modified punji trap waited on the western approach, directly in the path of anyone pursuing from the camp. He passed it carefully, marking its exact position in his mind, then continued northward for 50 meters before finding what he'd spotted earlier during his reconnaissance. A small clearing, perhaps 30 meters across, where a lightning struck, tree had opened a gap in the canopy. He crossed the clearing quickly, taking position in the tree line on its far side. The location was perfect, open enough to force anyone approaching to expose themselves, but with enough surrounding cover to allow for rapid escape if needed. More importantly, the western approach channeled directly past the punji trap, while the eastern approach required crossing a section of ground where Jack had concentrated his noise traps. Jack set his final preparation, a crude trip line attached to the remaining grenade, positioned at the northern edge of the clearing to prevent escape in that direction. Then he removed his shirt, tearing it into strips which he tied to branches at head height, just visible from the clearing. They appeared at a distance like glimpses of a man moving through the trees. Then he fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the universal signal for emergency among VC forces, and settled into position at the eastern edge of the clearing, AK-47 ready. The response came faster than he'd anticipated. Within minutes, voices approached from the south, a squad moving with purpose toward the gunfire. Jack remained motionless as they entered the clearing's edge, scanning for targets. A scream cut through the afternoon air. One of the soldiers had found the punji trap. Confusion erupted as men rushed to assist their fallen comrade, forgetting momentarily the quarry they'd been pursuing. That's when the whisper arrived. He materialized from the southern tree line like a spirit taking form, moving with that fluid grace that had made him so elusive. His Dragunov rifle swept the clearing in a practiced arc as he assessed the situation instantly. The fallen soldier, the distracted squad, the obvious trap. The whisper barked an order, and the squad immediately dispersed to the edges of the clearing, taking defensive positions. He hadn't survived this long by being careless. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the surrounding jungle, lingering on the strips of cloth Jack had positioned. Jack remained frozen, barely breathing, watching through a screen of leaves. The whisper took 3 steps into the clearing, then stopped, head cocked slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. His gaze shifted, moving inexorably toward Jack's position with uncomfortable precision. For a heartbeat, Jack was certain he'd been spotted, that the whisper's supernatural sense for tracking had located him despite all precautions. But the whisper's gaze moved past, continuing its methodical scan of the surroundings. Then deliberately, the whisper did something unexpected. He unslung his rifle, placing it carefully on the ground before him, straightened, and spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "I know you are watching, Marine. The game changes now. You have proven worthy. Face me." Jack felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. The voice was cultured, educated, nothing like what he'd expected. The whisper had been to America, perhaps had been trained there. The realization shifted something fundamental in Jack's understanding of his opponent. "No more shadows. Here," Whisper continued, spreading his hands to show they were empty. "No more games, 2 ghosts, 1 clearing, the true test." It was a trap. Had to be. The squad was still present, still armed, still watching the tree line for any movement. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger of the AK-47. One burst would end it, would complete his mission, would avenge Hawk. But something held him back. The same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 days of this deadly hunt. The whisper wanted him to fire, was counting on it. So again, Jack changed the rules. He extracted a grenade pin with his teeth, counted 2 seconds, then hurled. The grenade not at the whisper, but at the northern edge of the clearing, exactly where he'd set his own tripline explosive. The dual detonation was spectacular, sending dirt and vegetation showering across the clearing. In the momentary chaos, Jack burst from cover, not retreating, but charging directly at the whisper. The VC sniper's eyes widened in genuine surprise as Jack closed the distance between them, abandoning the AK-47 to draw his combat knife. The whisper reacted with blinding speed, sweeping up his rifle to block Jack's initial strike. The blade skittered off metal with a shower of sparks. The VC soldiers were shouting, weapons raised but hesitating to fire with their commander in the middle of the melee. Jack pressed forward, knife flashing in tight arcs. The Whisper countered with the rifle butt, then dropped the weapon entirely as they closed to grappling distance. A foot swept Jack's legs, but he rolled with the momentum, coming up with the knife still gripped tightly. The Whisper produced his own blade, longer than Jack's, curved like a miniature scythe. The two circled each other in the clearing's center, oblivious to the watching soldiers, to the jungle, to everything but each other. "You surprise me, Marine," the Whisper said, his voice betraying genuine admiration. "Few men would charge when they could shoot." "I'm not most men," Jack replied, his voice rough from days of disuse. "No," the Whisper agreed, lunging suddenly with his blade. "You are a ghost, like me." Jack parried, countered, felt his knife nick something solid before the Whisper danced away. Blood welled from a shallow cut on the Vietnamese sniper's forearm. First blood. The Whisper glanced at the wound, his expression unreadable. Then, to Jack's astonishment, he barked an order to the surrounding soldiers. They hesitated briefly before melting back into the jungle, leaving the two snipers alone in the clearing. "Now," the Whisper said, spinning his blade in a practiced flourish. "We finish what began when you entered my domain." They moved together like dancers in a lethal performance, blades flashing in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Jack fought with Marine hand-to-hand techniques, augmented by the rough-and-tumble brawling he'd learned in Montana barrooms. The Whisper's style was more fluid, more technical, likely formal training in some martial art Jack couldn't identify. They were evenly matched. For every cut or slash Jack landed, the Whisper returned one of equal measure. Blood from a dozen minor wounds soaked both men's clothing, turned the ground beneath their feet slick and treacherous. Jack felt his strength waning first. The days of minimal food and water, the constant stress, the earlier injuries, all exacted their toll. His movement slowed fractionally. The Whisper noticed immediately, pressing his advantage with a flurry of attacks that forced Jack to give ground. Retreating step by step, Jack found himself backed against the lightning-struck tree at the clearing's center. The Whisper advanced more cautiously now, blade low and ready, sensing the kill was near. "You fought well," the Whisper said, genuine, respect in his voice. "Your name will be remembered." Jack's back pressed against rough bark. His knife hand trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes remained locked on the Whisper's, unwavering. "So will yours," he replied. The Whisper nodded once, then lunged for the killing strike. Jack, summoning his last reserves of strength, dropped to one knee. The curved blade embedded itself in the tree trunk where his chest had been a moment before. Before the Whisper could free his weapon, Jack surged upward, driving his combat knife deep into his opponent's abdomen. The Whisper's eyes widened in shock, then understanding. His free hand gripped Jack's wrist, not to remove the blade, but almost as if to ensure it stayed in place. For a long moment, they remained frozen in this macabre embrace, faces inches apart. "A worthy end," the Whisper whispered, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Ghost to ghost." Jack held him as he slid to the ground, knife still embedded to the hilt. The Whisper's breathing grew ragged, but his eyes remained clear, focused on Jack's face as if memorizing it for some journey beyond. "Why?" Jack asked, the question that had haunted him since Hawk's death. "Why the game? Why not just kill me at the start?" The Whisper's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Because we are the same. Two ghosts, in a war of men." His hand fumbled at his jacket, extracting something with trembling fingers. "Take it. You earned it." A playing card. The ace of spades again, but weathered, creased from constant handling. Jack accepted it wordlessly, understanding its significance. The Whisper's personal token. His identity. "Your friend," the Whisper said, his voice fading. "The one I killed. He died well. Clean. A honor." Jack thought of Hawk, of the perfect, bullet hole in his forehead, a professional shot, a ghost's mercy. "What's your name?" Jack asked suddenly, needing to know, needing to put humanity to the myth. The Whisper's eyes were growing distant, focusing on something Jack couldn't see. Once, Nguyen Bao. Now, just Whisper. His bloody hand gripped Jack's wrist with surprising strength. "And you are no longer Jack Merritt. You are Ghost." His final breath rattled out and the hand on Jack's wrist went slack. The Whisper Nguyen Bao was gone, his eyes still open but empty now, reflecting the canopy above. Jack closed those eyes gently, then retrieved his knife, wiping it clean on his own pants leg before sheathing it. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of mission accomplished, just a hollow recognition that something extraordinary had passed from the world. He searched the Whisper's body methodically, taking only what he needed: ammunition for the Dragunov rifle, a compass, water, and rations. The rest he left, including the personal effects that might have told him more about the man who had become legend. Some ghosts deserved to keep their secrets. Jack stood, surveying the empty clearing that had become their final battlefield. The Whisper's men would return eventually, would find their commander's body, would likely pursue with renewed vigor. He needed to move, to disappear back into the jungle that had become more home than hostile territory. He paused only long enough to remove Hawk's dog tags from his pocket, studying them one last time before placing them around the Whisper's neck. A warrior's tribute. A recognition that all three of them, Hawk, the Whisper, and Jack himself, had been transformed by this jungle into something beyond ordinary soldiers. Then he melted into the tree line, becoming once more a phantom among shadows. Jack Merritt might eventually return to American lines, might resume his duties as a Marine sniper, might even survive this war to see Montana's mountains again. But something of him would remain forever in this clearing, the part that was still fully human, fully connected to the world of ordinary men. What moved now through the jungle was something else. A legend in the making, a ghost bearing the legacy of the enemy he'd bested and the friend he'd avenged. The Whisper was dead. Long live the ghost. The jungle closed around Jack like a living shroud, branches and vines seeming to part before him, then seal the path in his wake. He moved northwest, away from the clearing where the Whisper's body lay cooling in the afternoon sun, away from the VC battalion that would soon discover their fallen commander, away from the man he had been, and toward whatever he was becoming. The Dragunov felt strange in his hands, heavier than his M40, with unfamiliar balance and sightlines. But it was a sniper's weapon, lovingly maintained despite the harsh jungle conditions. The Whisper, Nguyen Bao, had been a professional in every sense. His rifle deserved equal respect. Jack paused at a small stream, kneeling to wash the Whisper's blood from his hands and face. The water ran red, then clear, carrying away the physical evidence of their confrontation, but leaving the memory etched in his mind with perfect clarity. The look in the Whisper's eyes as the knife found its mark. The respect in his voice as he acknowledged Jack as a worthy opponent. The strange peace in his final moments, as if he'd found the end he'd been seeking. "Ghost to ghost," Jack murmured, echoing the Whisper's final words. He checked his wounds methodically. None were immediately life-threatening, but the cumulative blood loss and strain of the past 4 days had pushed his body to its limits. His ankle throbbed with every step. The bullet graze along his side had reopened during the fight, seeping, blood that attracted buzzing insects. Smaller cuts and bruises mapped the journey of his transformation across his skin. The American lines were at least 30 kilometers away, 2 days' travel through hostile territory, assuming he could maintain a reasonable pace in his current condition. 2 days during which the Whisper's men would be hunting him with renewed determination, seeking vengeance for their fallen leader. One step at a time, Jack told himself, the sound of his own voice strange after days of near silence. He continued northwest as the day waned, following game trails where possible, staying off the more established paths. The jungle's sounds had become a language he understood now, the different calls that signaled danger, the sudden silences that warned of human presence, the subtle shifts in insect chorus that tracked the passage of larger creatures. The first patrol found him just before dusk. 6 VC soldiers moving in standard search formation, spread wide enough to cover ground but close enough to maintain visual contact. Jack spotted them before they saw him, freezing in the shadow of a massive strangler fig as they passed within 20 meters of his position. Their faces were grim, determined. News of the Whisper's death had clearly spread. These weren't conscripts performing routine sweeps. These were experienced fighters on a personal mission. They would not stop until they found the Whisper's killer or died trying. Jack let them pass, conserving his strength and ammunition. There would be more patrols, more opportunities for conflict. His mission now was survival, not engagement. Night fell with tropical swiftness, transforming the jungle into a realm of deeper shadow and strange sounds. Jack found a defensible position in the elevated roots of a banyan tree, creating a natural fortress that offered protection and clear sightlines of approaching threats. He allowed himself 2 hours of the combat microsleep he'd perfected, knowing he would need at least some rest to continue. Dawn broke gray and somber, heavy clouds promising rain that would further complicate his journey. Jack moved out immediately, maintaining his northwestern heading while paralleling a narrow stream that would eventually join the river, marking the edge of VC-controlled territory. The rain began mid-morning, a steady downpour that reduced visibility, but also masked sound and scent. Jack used it to increase his pace, pushing his battered body harder now that detection was less likely. By noon, he estimated he'd covered nearly 10 kilometers, a third of the distance to relative safety. Then he heard it, the distinctive whoomp 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 of helicopter rotors barely audible over the rain. American, a Huey from the sound of it, flying low and slow. A medevac run, perhaps, or a resupply mission to one of the forward bases. Jack changed course immediately, angling toward the sound. If he could reach an area where the helicopter might spot him, might see a signal. The thought died as quickly as it formed. The chopper was moving away, the sound fading to the west. And in its wake came another sound. Voices, Vietnamese, urgent and organized. The patrol had heard it too and was converging on his position, using the helicopter noise as cover for their own movement. Jack dropped to the ground as the first shots tore through the foliage around him. AK-47 fire, at least 3 different weapons. They hadn't spotted him specifically, were firing at movement or shadows, hoping to flush him out. He crawled forward, keeping to the densest undergrowth, using the rain-soaked earth to minimize sound. A shout to his left indicated someone had spotted sign of his passage. The firing ceased, replaced by the more dangerous sound of coordinated movement through the jungle. They were spreading out, establishing a perimeter, preparing to tighten the noose methodically. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were the Whisper's elite. Jack assessed his options clinically. Running would lead to more pursuit, more energy expended. Fighting would alert other patrols in the area. Hiding was temporary at best against trackers of this caliber. The Dragunov felt suddenly right in his hands, the weapon of a hunter who had mastered this very terrain, who had tracked prey just as determined as Jack himself. If he was to survive, he would need to become the Whisper, to see this jungle not as hostile territory, but as a weapon, an ally, an extension of himself. Jack climbed, using the network of vines and interlocking branches that formed the jungle's middle canopy. He ascended 15 meters above the forest floor, disappearing into the realm where light and shadow danced in constant flux. Below, the patrol spread out in ever-widening circles from where they'd first fired, searching for trails on the ground, checking the obvious hiding spots. None looked up. Jack positioned himself in a natural cradle formed by intersecting branches. The Dragunov braced and ready. Through its scope, he tracked the movements of the patrol, 6 men moving with precision that confirmed his assessment of their elite status. The leader gestured silently, directing the others with hand signals that mirrored American Special Forces techniques. American-trained, like the Whisper himself had likely been. Jack watched, unmoving, as they completed their sweep of the immediate area and began to move north, directly in his path. They would need to be dealt with if he was to continue. Not out of vengeance, not out of duty, but simple survival. The shot, when he took it, was perfect. The patrol leader's head snapped back, body crumpling without a sound. Before the others could react, Jack had already shifted position, moving laterally through the canopy to a new firing location 20 meters east. The remaining 5 scattered for cover, shouting to each other as they tried to locate the source of the shot. One broke from concealment, attempting to drag the leader's body to safety. Jack's second shot caught him in the chest. He fell across the body he'd tried to save. Silence descended, broken only by the constant patter of rain through leaves. The remaining 4 had gone to ground, invisible now even through the scope. Jack waited, controlling his breathing, becoming part of the canopy. Minutes stretched. No movement below. They were waiting for him to make a mistake, to reveal his position. It was what Jack himself would have done. Establish a defensive perimeter, minimize exposure, force the sniper to either withdraw or take another shot that might give away his location. But Jack had no intention of withdrawing. Ghost tactics, he whispered to himself, the words a talisman. He unslung his canteen, calculating trajectories and timing with practiced precision. With a controlled motion, he sent it arcing away from his position, crashing through branches before landing with a splash in a muddy depression 30 meters southwest. The response was immediate. Concentrated fire tore into the area where the canteen had landed. 3 muzzle flashes visible from Jack's position, their origins now marked in his mental map of the terrain. 1 remained unaccounted for. Moving, silently, Jack repositioned again, circling north through the canopy. The 4th soldier had separated from the others, was attempting to flank the perceived threat. Smart. Dangerous. Jack found him slipping through the underbrush, eyes focused, on the area of the canteen distraction. Through the Dragunov's scope, the shot presented itself. Center mass, minimal adjustment for wind, near perfect conditions despite the rain. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. There was something in the soldier's movements, a hesitation, a youth evident even at this distance. Not a hardened fighter, but a conscript, frightened yet determined, a boy doing his duty as he understood it. Hawk's voice seemed to whisper in Jack's ear, "We're better than them because we don't have to be like them." Jack shifted his aim and fired. The bullet shattered the stock of the boy's rifle, sending wooden splinters into his arm but leaving him otherwise unharmed. The boy cried out, dropped the useless weapon, and ran. Not toward his comrades, but away east, toward the safety of the VC camp. 1 down without bloodshed. 3 to go. The remaining soldiers had gone completely silent, no longer firing at shadows. They had recognized the nature of their opponent now, not a fleeing target, but a predator hunting them in turn. The dynamic had shifted. Jack watched through the scope as they began to withdraw, moving with disciplined care, covering each other's retreat. They were cutting their losses, choosing survival over a battle they now realized they couldn't win, against a ghost they couldn't see. He let them go. Unnecessary killing would only bring more patrols, more complications. The message had been delivered. Pursue at your own peril. When they had disappeared from sight, Jack descended to the forest floor, retrieving his canteen before continuing northwest. The encounter had cost him time and 3 precious rounds of ammunition, but had earned him something more valuable, a reputation. Word would spread of the Whisper's replacement, a new ghost haunting the jungle. It might buy him the space he needed to reach American lines. By nightfall, the rain had subsided to a gentle mist that clung to every surface. Jack established another defensive position, this time in a rocky outcropping that offered natural concealment and protection against approach from 3 sides. He allowed himself to eat a small portion of the rations taken from the Whisper's body, knowing he would need the energy for the final push tomorrow. As he chewed the unfamiliar rice cake, Jack found himself thinking not of home or safety, but of the Whisper, of the strange bond they had formed through their deadly contest, of the respect that had transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and ideology. In another life, they might have hunted together rather than hunting each other. Ghost to ghost, he repeated softly, the phrase taking on the quality of a prayer. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the constant vigilance that had become second nature. Dreams blended with reality. Hawk's face morphing into the whispers, Montana mountains becoming Vietnamese jungle, his father's voice speaking in a language he shouldn't understand, but somehow did. Dawn found him already moving, pushing northwest, with renewed determination. The terrain began to change subtly, the jungle thinning in places, giving way to more open areas where bombing had cleared sections of canopy. Signs of the wider war that had seemed so distant during his private battle with the Whisper. By mid-morning, Jack had reached a ridgeline that offered a commanding view of the valley beyond. Through the Dragunov's scope, he could make out the glint of water, the river that marked the boundary between VC-controlled territory and the region where American patrols regularly operated. Less than 5 kilometers now. A few hours' journey, assuming no further complications. Movement in the valley below caught his attention. A substantial VC force, at least 20 men, establishing positions along the likely crossing points of the river. Not a routine patrol. An ambush, specifically positioned to catch him if he attempted to cross. Word had spread faster than he'd anticipated. The Whisper's men were closing the net, using their knowledge of the territory to predict his route and destination. They had learned from their commander, had adopted his methods of thinking like his prey. Jack settled behind a fallen log, studying the deployment below. The ambush was well conceived, covering all the obvious crossing points with overlapping fields of fire. A frontal approach would be suicide. Attempting to find an uncovered section of river would consume time he didn't have and energy he couldn't spare. For the first time since Hawk's death, Jack felt the cold touch of doubt. His body was at its limits. Wounds untreated, resources nearly depleted, strength fading with each hour. The Whisper's elite forces had the advantage of numbers, position, and health. The rational choice was clear. Find a defensible position, conserve ammunition, wait for darkness, and attempt a night crossing at the point of least resistance. But instinct told him otherwise. The same instinct that had kept him alive through days of being hunted. The same instinct that had guided his hand in the final confrontation with the Whisper. They were expecting him to behave like a desperate, wounded American soldier trying to reach safety. He would not give them what they expected. Instead, he would give them the Whisper. Jack checked the Dragunov, confirming the 5 remaining rounds. Not much, but enough if used perfectly. He studied the VC positions once more, identifying the command element. 3 men clustered near a distinctive boulder at the river's edge, one clearly giving orders to runners who then dispersed to the other positions. Range, approximately 600 meters. Significant, but not impossible. Wind, minimal, from the northwest at perhaps 5 knots. Humidity, high but consistent. Temperature, steady. Jack settled into position, controlling his breathing as he had been taught in sniper school, as he had practiced countless times in Montana's mountains, as he had refined through months of jungle warfare. His heartbeat slowed. The world narrowed to the view through the scope, to the calculations of physics and probability that would guide a small piece of metal across space to a precise destination. This was what he had been trained for, what he had lived for, what Hawk had died for. The first shot broke the valley's silence like a thunderclap, echoing off the surrounding hills. Through the scope, Jack watched the VC commander crumple, a perfect shot through the center of mass. Before the echo had faded, he had already adjusted his aim and fired again. The second officer fell beside the first. Jack was moving instantly, sliding sideways along the ridgeline to a position 30 meters east. Below, the VC forces had scattered. For cover, returning fire blindly at the ridgeline. Bullets tore through foliage and shattered rock nowhere near his new position. He took the third shot from concealment behind a massive boulder, targeting a machine gun nest that had been established near the river's narrowest point. The gunner pitched backward, weapon falling silent. Jack disappeared again, circling back toward his original position as confusion reigned in the valley below. It wasn't merely a sniper attack to the VC. It was the return of the Whisper, their legendary protector whom they believed dead, now seemingly resurrected and turned against them. He could see it in their panicked movements, their desperate gestures, their frantic radio communications. The fourth shot he saved, watching through the scope as the remaining forces began a disorganized withdrawal from the river crossing. They weren't retreating in his direction. They were pulling back eastward, away from what they perceived as the Whisper's hunting ground. Opening a path. Jack waited until they had disappeared into the tree line before beginning his own descent toward the river. Every step sent pain lancing through his injured ankle. Every movement pulled at the wounds that mapped his body. But the path was clear, the final obstacle removed. He reached the river as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley. The water flowed dark and swift, perhaps 40 meters across at its narrowest point. On the far side lay relatively safety, territory where American patrols operated regularly, where he might encounter friendly forces. Jack checked his remaining equipment one final time before entering the water. The current was stronger than it appeared, tugging at his legs as he waded deeper. By midstream, he was swimming. The Dragunov held awkwardly above the water with one arm while the other fought the river's pull. The shot came without warning, a single crack that echoed across the water. Pain blossomed in Jack's left shoulder, spinning him half around as blood clouded the water around him. Through the shock and the sudden cold, he understood immediately. One of the Whisper's men had remained behind, had waited patiently for this precise moment of maximum vulnerability, had taken the shot that the Whisper himself would have taken. Jack's legs went numb, no longer responding to his commands. The river seized him, pulling him downstream as he struggled to keep his head above water with his one functioning arm. The Dragunov slipped from his grasp, disappearing beneath the surface. The far shore seemed impossibly distant, wavering in his fading vision. Another shot cracked over the sound of rushing water, missing by centimeters. The sniper adjusting, compensating for the current. The next would not miss. With his remaining strength, Jack pulled the Whisper's ace of spades from his pocket, held it up as the current carried him downstream. A signal, a recognition, a confession, ghost to ghost. The third shot never came. Jack felt consciousness, slipping away as the river carried him, his blood leaving a trail in the dark water. The pain had faded to a distant awareness, replaced by a strange peace. If this was death, it wasn't what he had expected. There was no fear, no regret. Just the water holding him, carrying him, accepting him as the jungle had accepted him. His last conscious thought was of the Whisper's eyes as life had left them, not defeated but satisfied, as if he had found exactly the end he had been seeking. Jack understood now. In the sniper's art, there was always a final shot. Sometimes you took it, sometimes you received it. But it always came, inevitable as gravity, as certain as the jungle's claim on all who entered its domain. As darkness claimed him, Jack surrendered to the river's embrace, to the final shot that had been waiting for him since the moment Hawk fell. Ghost to ghost, hunter to hunter. The river carried him home. Consciousness returned in fragments, the IDD, cool touch of water against skin, the distant murmur of voices, the sharp scent of antiseptic cutting through the jungle's perpetual decay. Jack blinked against harsh light, his vision swimming into focus, then dissolving again into blurred shapes and shadows. "He's coming around," a voice said. American accent, professional tone. BP's stabilizing, pulse 110 and steady. Jack tried to speak, but his throat felt raw as if he'd swallowed broken glass. A hand pressed against his uninjured shoulder, gentle but firm. "Easy, Marine. You're at Field Hospital 6. You're safe." Safe. The word had no meaning anymore. Safety was a myth told to children, a comforting lie with no substance. In the jungle, there was only the hunt and the hunted, the living and the dead, and sometimes the space between, the ghosts. "How?" Jack managed, the single syllable taking all his remaining strength. "Riverine Patrol found you washed up on a sandbar 2 clicks south of Victor Crossing. You'd lost a lot of blood. That shoulder wound alone should have killed you." The doctor, Jack could see the rank insignia now. A captain shook his head in professional admiration. Whoever patched you up out there knew what they were doing. Primitive, but effective. Saved your life. Jack's mind struggled to process this information. He had no memory of being treated, of anyone finding him after he'd been shot in the river. The last clear memory was of surrendering to the current, of holding up the Whisper's card as consciousness faded. No one helped me, he rasped. The doctor exchanged glances with a nurse standing nearby. Well, someone did. You had a field dressing on that shoulder that wasn't standard issue. Some kind of herbal poultice packed into the wound. Vietnamese medicine, according to our translator. Jack closed his eyes, pieces clicking into place with cold precision. The missing shot, the one that should have finished him in the river but never came. Someone had been watching, had made a choice. Not all ghosts were enemies. How long? He asked. You've been out for nearly 36 hours. It's May 12th, 1968. Arrow 900 hours. 5 days since Hawk's death. 5 days that had transformed Jack Merritt from a Marine sniper into something else entirely. Something without a name or designation in any military manual. Lieutenant Walker has been asking to debrief you. The doctor continued. Said to tell you they recovered your original rifle. An M40 sniper variant, apparently. Found it near where your spotter was KIA. Hawk. The name rose unbidden in Jack's mind, accompanied by the perfect image of his friend's face in death. The precise bullet hole in his forehead. The empty eyes staring skyward. Not ready, Jack said simply. The doctor nodded. No rush, you're not going anywhere for at least a week. That shoulder needs time, and you've got a collection of other injuries that would put a reasonable man in traction. Jack didn't respond. A week, a month, a year, it made no difference. Time had become elastic, measured not in hours but in heartbeats, in breaths, in the spaces between thoughts. Get some rest, the doctor said, patting his good shoulder before moving away. The morphine should help with the pain. But no morphine could touch the pain that had settled into Jack's core. A hollow ache that had nothing to do with physical wounds and everything to do with what he'd become in the jungle, with what he'd left behind. Sleep claimed him again, but it brought no peace. In his dreams he hunted and was hunted through endless green corridors. Hawk walked beside him, speaking in the Whisper's cultured English. The Whisper himself appeared, and disappeared like a mirage, always just out of reach, always watching with those knowing eyes. Ghost to ghost, the Dream Whisper said, his voice echoing across impossible distances. We are the same now. Jack woke with a strangled gasp, sweat soaking the hospital sheets despite the tense air conditioning. Night had fallen. The ward dimmed to allow patients rest. In the next bed, a soldier missing both legs twitched and mumbled in sedated sleep. Beyond him, a row of similar beds stretched into shadow, each containing its own broken piece of the war. A figure sat beside Jack's bed, motionless in the dimness. For one disorienting moment, Jack thought it was the Whisper come to finish their duel. Then the figure leaned forward, the faint light revealing Lieutenant James Walker's haggard features. They said you were awake earlier, Walker said quietly. Thought I'd wait. Jack studied his commanding officer with detached interest. Walker looked older than he had 5 days ago. New lines etched around his eyes and mouth. The burden of command in a war that made less sense with each passing day. Sir, Jack acknowledged, his voice stronger but still raw. Walker glanced at the clipboard hanging from the end of the bed. The doctors say you'll make a full recovery, physically at least. He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. They found Hawk's body, bringing him home tomorrow. Full honors. Jack nodded once, unable to form words around the sudden tightness in his throat. What I can't figure out, Walker continued, is why we also found a VC sniper, a high-value target according to intelligence, with Hawk's dog tags around his neck. He fixed Jack with a penetrating stare. Care to explain that, Corporal? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Jack could feel the weight of Walker's expectation, the need for a report that would make sense of events that defied military logic. A narrative that would fit into the clean categories of ally and enemy, victory and defeat. But there was no report that could capture what had happened in the jungle. No official language for the bond forged between two ghosts who had recognized in each other something beyond uniform or nationality. "No, sir," Jack replied finally. "I can't explain it." Walker's jaw tightened, but he didn't press. After 20 years in the Corps, he recognized the look in Jack's eyes. The 1,000-yard stare of a man who had gone beyond the boundaries of ordinary combat into something else. Something you didn't push unless you were prepared for what might push back. "Intelligence is climbing all over this," Walker said instead. "They're calling the VC sniper the Whisper. Apparently, he was some kind of legend among the local forces. His death is being seen as a major psychological victory." Victory. Another word that had lost meaning. What had the Whisper said in his final moments? A worthy end. Ghost to ghost. Not surrender, not defeat, just the completion of something, inevitable. "They'll want to talk to you when you're stronger," Walker continued. "The brass, intelligence, maybe even some suits from Washington. This is being spun as a big win." Jack turned his gaze to the tense canvas ceiling, suddenly exhausted beyond words. Let them spin whatever narrative they needed. Let them claim whatever victory justified the expenditure of young lives in this endless green hell. The truth belonged to the jungle now, to the ghosts that haunted its shadows. "There's something else," Walker said, his voice dropping further. "The VC forces in the region have been unusually quiet since we recovered the bodies. Almost respectful. Intel says they're calling the killer of the Whisper by a new name." He hesitated. "They're calling him the Ghost." Something cold settled in Jack's chest. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. The wheel had turned full circle. The hunted had become the hunter, had become the legend. "Get some rest, Merritt," Walker said, rising to leave. "We'll talk more when you're ready." But Jack knew there would be no more talking. No debriefing, no reports, no medals or commendations. Whatever had happened in the jungle would remain there, sealed away in the space between his heartbeats. Walker paused at the foot of the bed, studying Jack with an expression that mingled concern with something else. Fear, perhaps. The instinctive wariness of a man confronting something he doesn't understand. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry about Hawk. He was a good Marine." Jack closed his eyes, not in dismissal, but in acceptance. Yes, Hawk had been a good Marine, had died a Marine's death, had been avenged in a warrior's duel that had nothing to do with the larger conflict surrounding it. When he opened his eyes again, Walker was gone, leaving Jack alone with the shadows and the memories. Sleep refused to return. Jack lay awake as the night deepened, listening to the sounds of the field hospital, the muted groans of the wounded, the soft footfalls of night shift nurses, the distant thrum of generators powering the lights and equipment. All of it seeming unreal, disconnected from the jungle reality that had become his true existence. Near dawn, Jack felt a presence beside his bed again. Not Walker this time, but a slight figure in white hospital garb. A Vietnamese woman, her features delicate but her eyes holding the same ageless wisdom he'd seen in the Whisper's gaze. "You should be sleeping," she said softly, checking the IV drip with practiced efficiency. Her English was perfect, accentless. "Can't," Jack replied simply. She studied him with clinical detachment, noting the tension in his body, the alertness that belied his physical condition. "The wound heals," she said, "but the spirit remains injured." "Are you a doctor?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. A small smile touched her lips. "I am a nurse here. Before I was many things." Her hand moved to adjust his bandage with unexpected gentleness. "In my village, they called me a healer." The pieces locked into place with cold certainty. "It was you," Jack said. At the river. She neither confirmed nor denied, her expression revealing nothing. Many ghosts walk in this war, she said instead. Some choose to kill, some choose to save. The path is always a choice. Why help? Me? The question emerged unbidden, raw with the need to understand. I killed one of your own. The nurse, the healer, stepped back, her face half hidden in shadow. Nguyen Bao chose his path long ago, as did you. As did I. She moved toward the foot of the bed. Rest now, ghost. Your war is not yet finished. She glided away before Jack could respond, disappearing among the rows of beds like mist dissolving in morning sun. He wasn't entirely certain she had been real, perhaps another hallucination, another ghost conjured by his fractured psyche. Yet the conversation left him strangely settled, as if some unspoken question had finally found its answer. Jack closed, his eyes surrendering at last to the exhaustion that had been his constant companion since Hawk's death. This time, he dreamt of Montana, of crystalline streams and snow-capped peaks, of his father teaching him to track elk through pristine forest, to read the language of the wilderness, to become one with the landscape until predator and environment were indistinguishable. The land remembers, his father said in the dream, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had lived by nature's laws, and so do the ghosts who walk it. Jack woke to bright morning light filtering through the tent walls, the hospital alive with daytime activity. A new doctor, younger than the first, with the harried look of someone perpetually behind schedule, was examining his chart. Good news, Corporal, the doctor said without preamble. Infection risk is minimal. Shoulders responding well to treatment. Barring complications, we'll have you evacuated to the Naval Hospital in Japan within 72 hours. Japan. Then probably home. Discharge papers, civilian life. The expected progression for a wounded Marine who had served with distinction. The path back to normal existence. But normal was a country Jack could no longer locate on any map. The compass of his being pointed somewhere else now. Somewhere without name or borders, populated by the ghosts of the fallen and those who walked among them. Thank you, Doctor, he replied automatically, the words empty of meaning. Throughout the day, various officials came and went, a major from intelligence asking pointed questions about the Whisper's tactics and capabilities. A chaplain offering spiritual comfort Jack neither wanted nor needed. Nurses changing bandages and administering medication with impersonal efficiency. Jack answered when required, nodded when appropriate, performed the expected dance of a recovering soldier. But he wasn't there. Not really. His essence remained in the jungle, moving silent as smoke between trees, calculating wind and distance for the perfect shot, measuring his breath against the rhythm of another hunter's movements. As twilight approached, bringing relative quiet to the ward, Jack made his decision. It crystallized not as a conscious thought, but as an inevitability, like the path of a bullet once fired. He waited until the night shift took over, until the lights dimmed and the ward settled into the restless sleep of the wounded. Then, with movements that ignored pain in favor of precision, he disconnected his IV, swung his legs over the edge of the bed, and stood. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him, his weakened body protesting the sudden demand. Jack steadied himself, against the bed frame, breathing through the wave of dizziness until it passed. One step, then another. Each movement an act of will against physical limitation. His personal effects had been stored in a footlocker beneath the bed, standard procedure for wounded brought in from the field. Jack knelt painfully, retrieving the battered metal box and opening it with steady hands. The contents were sparse. Blood-stained fatigues, combat boots caked with jungle mud, a combat knife meticulously cleaned despite the chaos of its last use. His sidearm unloaded per hospital regulations, the magazine stored separately, and 3 playing cards kept together in a waterproof pouch. The ace of spades with the crude hourglass drawn in blood. The Suicide King marked worthy. And the Whisper's personal ace of spades, worn smooth from handling. Jack dressed slowly, methodically, ignoring the pull of stitches and the protest of healing wounds. Each article of clothing returned a piece of his identity, not the Marine he had been, but the ghost he had become. When he tucked the playing cards into his breast pocket, directly above his heart, the transformation was complete. No one challenged him as he walked from the ward, his movements deliberate but unremarkable. In a field hospital processing hundreds of casualties weekly, one more soldier walking with the stiffness of recent wounds was hardly noteworthy. The night guard at the perimeter checkpoint glanced at his bandages, nodded in silent understanding of a man seeking brief escape, and waved him through. The air outside hit Jack like a physical force, thick with humidity, alive with jungle sounds that called to something primal in his blood. He stood for a moment, orienting himself by stars partially obscured by cloud cover. Southeast, toward the river. Toward the domain where he had hunted and been hunted. Going somewhere, Ghost? The voice came from shadow, familiar yet unexpected. Jack turned, unsurprised to find Lieutenant Walker leaning against a supply crate, a cigarette's ember glowing in the darkness. Just needed air, Jack replied, the lie falling flat between them. Walker took a long drag, the cigarette's glow illuminating haggard features. Bullshit. You're going back in. It wasn't a question. Jack didn't bother denying it. The doctors say you'll die without proper treatment, Walker continued conversationally. That shoulder wound is no joke. Infection, blood loss, shock. Take your pick of ways to die alone in the jungle. Jack said nothing. The lieutenant was merely voicing calculations he'd already made and accepted. Walker sighed, flicking the cigarette away. I'm supposed to stop you, order you back to that bed, have you sedated and restrained if necessary? He straightened, meeting Jack's gaze directly. But we both know that man in there isn't Corporal Jack Merritt anymore, is he? The question hung in the humid air between them, weighted with understanding that transcended rank and regulation. No, sir, Jack answered finally. He's not. Walker nodded, a gesture of acceptance rather than approval. They'll list you as AWOL, then MIA, eventually KIA when no body turns up. A humorless smile twisted his lips. Paperwork's always neater with a closed file. Yes, sir. The intelligence boys won't be happy. They had plans for you. Medals, promotions, maybe even a tour back home to boost morale. Walker shook his head. But that's not your war anymore, is it? Jack's hand moved unconsciously to the pocket containing the playing cards. No, sir. Walker studied him for a long moment, seeing not a subordinate but something his military experience provided no context for. Finally, he reached into his own pocket, extracting a folded map and a small compass. VC activity has increased 10 clicks east of the river. Command thinks they're preparing for a major offensive against Firebase Conroy. He held out the items. If someone were to provide advance warning, specific intelligence on troop movements, weapons placements, command structure, it could save a lot of American lives. Jack accepted the map and compass, understanding the unspoken contract. Not orders, but an acknowledgement of what he had become. What he could accomplish that no conventional force could. If I hear anything, he said quietly, I'll send word. Walker nodded, then extended his hand. Not a salute. That gesture belonged to the world of uniforms and regulations they were leaving behind. A handshake, man to man, ghost to human. Godspeed, Merritt, Walker said as their hands clasped briefly. Or whatever watches over men like you now. Jack turned without reply, moving southeast toward the perimeter's edge. Each step sent pain, lancing through his damaged body, each breath a reminder of how close death had come. But with every meter, the hospital's sounds faded and the jungle's call grew stronger. He passed through a gap in the concertina wire, a deliberate weak point in the defenses that Walker had clearly arranged. Beyond lay darkness and wilderness, danger and freedom, the domain of ghosts. As Jack crossed the invisible boundary between base and jungle, he felt Hawk walking beside him, not as a haunting presence but as a companion, a memory given form through will alone. On his other side, impossibly, walked the Whisper, his movements fluid and precise, as they had been in life, ghost to ghost. Jack whispered to the empty air, to the shadows, to the spirits only he could perceive. And the jungle welcomed him home, swallowing his silhouette until nothing remained but legend, a story told in whispers around VC campfires, a rumor passed between American platoons, a ghost that moved between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The ghost had returned to the trees, and the hunt continued. The monsoon season descended upon Vietnam with apocalyptic fury. Rain fell in solid sheets, turning jungle trails to rushing rivers and transforming the landscape into a sodden, impenetrable maze. For most soldiers, it was a time of misery, of trench foot and perpetual dampness, of mud that seemed to seep into flesh and bone, of operations ground to a halt by nature's overwhelming force. For Jack, it was perfect cover. 2 weeks had passed since he'd walked away from the field hospital, from his identity as Corporal Jack Merritt, from the war as America fought it. In that time, he'd moved deeper into contested territory, establishing a network of observation posts in the canopy, where neither American patrols nor VC units typically operated. The no man's land between forces had become his domain, a liminal space where only ghosts could survive. His shoulder wound had festered briefly, then begun healing after he'd applied a poultice of crushed leaves, a remedy learned from watching Montagnard tribesmen treat similar injuries. His other wounds had closed, leaving a map of scars that chronicled his transformation. He moved differently now, with the fluid economy of a jungle predator, conserving energy except when striking was necessary. Jack had kept his unspoken promise to Lieutenant Walker, sending back intelligence through channels only they understood. A VC ammunition cache marked by an ace of spades left at an American patrol's rest point. Enemy troop movements signaled by strategic shots fired to direct friendly forces away from ambush sites, warning signs that saved American lives without ever revealing their source. The rumors had grown, whispered between villages and bases alike. The ghost walked the jungle, neither American nor Vietnamese, neither living nor dead, but something between, a spirit of the forest that answered to no flag or cause. Only Jack knew the truth, that he was still just a man, pushed to the edge of humanity by circumstance and choice. A man haunted not by supernatural forces but by the very tangible ghosts of those he'd encountered. Hawk's laugh still echoed in quiet moments. The Whisper's eyes still watched from shadow. On this particular morning, Jack crouched beneath a makeshift shelter of broad leaves, waiting for the torrential rain to subside enough for movement. His current position was 10 kilometers west of Firebase Conroy, in an area frequented by VC supply lines moving men and materials south. He'd been tracking a particular unit for 3 days, one led by officers who'd served with the Whisper, who might have information about the female medic mentioned in Walker's last dead-drop message, Mai Lin, a name Jack had heard whispered by captured VC soldiers before they were evacuated. A healer who moved between factions, treating wounded regardless of uniform, who some said possessed the power to walk unseen through battle zones, protected by spirits who recognized her compassion in a landscape of cruelty. The medic who might have saved him at the river, the ghost who might be more like him than anyone else in this war-torn country. The rain slackened from deluge to merely heavy, enough improvement for Jack to continue his hunt. He moved through the jungle with practiced silence, each step placed with deliberate care to avoid the sucking mud that would leave sign of his passage. The Dragunov rifle, recovered from the river by methods Jack preferred not to examine too closely, remained slung across his back, protected from moisture by a waterproof covering fashioned from enemy ponchos. By midday, Jack had located the VC unit's temporary camp, a collection of quickly erected shelters tucked beneath a ridge that offered some protection from the rain. 20 men, 3 officers, a radio team. Standard configuration for a reinforced squad on extended patrol. They had established a defensive perimeter, but it was perfunctory. This deep in their territory, they clearly felt secure. Jack settled into observation position, a natural blind formed by fallen trees and dense undergrowth. Through field glasses, salvaged from an abandoned American position, he studied the camp's routine, identifying the command structure, noting patrol patterns, cataloging weapons and supplies. No sign of medical personnel. No indication this unit had any connection to the mysterious Mai Lin. Perhaps the intelligence had been wrong, or perhaps she had already moved on, following the fluid path of need that traversed the artificial boundaries of conflict. As dusk approached, Jack prepared to withdraw. This unit presented no immediate threat to American forces, carried no intelligence worth the risk of closer contact. He would continue his search elsewhere, following the whispers and rumors that formed the invisible map of his existence now. The shot that split the evening stillness came from behind him. Precise, professional, striking the tree trunk centimeters from Jack's head. Not a killing shot, a warning, a greeting between equals. Jack froze, calculating angles and positions. With automatic precision, the shooter was perhaps 50 meters back, positioned on higher ground with clear sightlines to his location. A position Jack himself would have chosen for an ambush, had chosen countless times, when he was the hunter rather than the hunted. The ghost should not linger so close to the camp of men. A woman's voice called softly in English, touched with the musical cadence of Vietnamese. Unless he wishes to be seen. Jack remained motionless, every sense straining to detect any additional presence, any indication this was a trap, rather than the one-on-one encounter it appeared to be. Nothing but the steady patter of rain on leaves and the distant sounds of the VC camp, oblivious to the drama unfolding nearby. "If I wanted you dead, ghost, you would be dead." The voice continued, closer now but still invisible in the gathering darkness. "As you wanted Nguyen Bao dead, and succeeded where many failed." The mention of the whisper's true name sent a chill through Jack that had nothing to do with the rain seeping through his makeshift poncho. Few knew that name. Fewer still would speak it aloud, as if the very syllables might summon the legend back from whatever afterlife claimed fallen warriors. "Show yourself," Jack replied, his voice rough from disuse, the English feeling strange, on his tongue after weeks of silence. A figure materialized from the gloom, moving with the same fluid grace Jack had come to associate with those who truly belonged to the jungle. A woman, smaller than he'd expected, dressed in the simple black garments of VC medical personnel. Her features were delicate, but her eyes, those eyes held the same ancient knowledge he'd seen in the whisper's gaze, in his own reflection when he managed to glimpse it in still water. She carried a Soviet Mosin Nagant sniper rifle with the easy familiarity of long use, its barrel still warm from the recent shot. "Mai Lin, it could be no one else. The Americans believe you are dead," she said, stopping at a respectful distance, close enough for conversation, far enough for safety. "The VC believe you are a vengeful spirit. Only I know you are merely a man who has lost his way." "Not lost," Jack corrected quietly. "Changed." A smile touched her lips, brief as lightning through cloud. "Yes, as the butterfly is not lost, but changed." She studied him with clinical detachment, noting the healed wounds, the altered posture, the eyes that no longer looked at the jungle but through it. "The river should have claimed you, yet here you stand." "Someone saved me," Jack said. "At the river, applied a field dressing, left me where American patrols would find me." Mai Lin's expression revealed nothing. Perhaps the jungle itself decided your time had not yet come. "It was you." She made a non-committal gesture, neither confirming nor denying. "I have taken an oath to preserve life where I can, even the lives of those who bring death to my country." Her gaze hardened. "But that was before I knew you had killed Nguyen Bao." The accusation hung between them, weighted with personal grief that transcended the anonymous killing of war. Jack recognized it instantly, the same grief that had driven him to hunt the Whisper after Hawk's death, the same need for retribution that had transformed him from soldier to ghost. "You knew him," Jack said, not a question. "He was my brother," Mai Lin replied simply. "Not by blood but by choice, by the bonds forged in suffering." Her fingers tightened imperceptibly on her rifle. We were children together when the French bombed our village, orphans together in the years that followed, soldiers together when there was no choice but to fight. Jack's mind raced, assembling this new information into the complex puzzle of the Whisper's identity. The cultured English, the professional precision, the almost mystical regard in which he was held by his men. He was trained by the French, Jack said, understanding dawning. Before they withdrew, a collaborative program with American advisors. My Lin nodded once. The best marksmen from local forces, trained to Western standards, intended to form an elite unit to combat growing communist influence. A bitter smile touched her lips. They did not anticipate their pupils would eventually turn these skills against new invaders. And you were trained alongside him, Jack continued, the pieces locking into place. The female counterpart, the healer to his killer. Balance in all things, Mai Lin confirmed. Nguyen Bao and I are parts of the same whole. For every life he took, I tried to save another. For every wound he inflicted, I tried to heal one. Her voice hardened. Until you broke the balance. Jack felt the accusation like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it crystallized something he'd felt since standing over the Whisper's body. The sense that he had not just killed a man, but disrupted something fundamental in the natural order of this place. He killed my friend, Jack said simply. My brother, though not by blood. Recognition flickered in Mai Lin's eyes, the universal understanding of loss that transcended language and allegiance. The spotter, the one with the perfect wound. She nodded slowly. Nguyen Bao spoke of him, said he had died well with dignity. It was meant as respect. It was taken as challenge, Jack replied. They stood in silence as the rain continued its steady percussion on leaves and earth. Two ghosts recognizing in each other the mirrored reflections of their own pain. The mission that had driven Jack to this moment, the intelligence gathering, the strategic warnings, the continued hunt, seemed suddenly hollow compared to this unexpected connection. I could kill you now, Mai Lin said finally, the statement practical rather than threatening. Complete the circle, balance restored. Jack made no move toward his weapons, no attempt to establish defensive position. You could try. The faintest suggestion of a smile touched her lips, acknowledging the quiet confidence in his response. She had tracked him, yes. Had positioned herself perfectly for an ambush, but they both knew the outcome of any conflict between them was far from certain. Ghost to ghost, hunter to hunter. Or, she continued, lowering her rifle slightly, we could acknowledge that enough blood has soaked this ground. That vengeance serves only to create more ghosts, more hunters, more killing, without end. Jack felt something shift within him, a tectonic movement of the spirit that had been building since he'd walked away from the field hospital, since he'd stood over the Whisper's body and felt not triumph, but a strange, hollow completion. What do you propose? He asked, though he already sensed her answer. Mai Lin gestured toward the distant VC camp, then toward the west, where Firebase Conroy lay beyond the horizon. This war will continue with or without us. More young men will die, believing their sacrifice matters to old men who draw lines on maps. Her gaze met his directly. Or we can choose another path. Neutrality? Jack's tone made clear his skepticism. Balance, she corrected. You have already begun, warning your former comrades of danger while refusing to engage directly. I have done the same for mine. She took a step closer, entering the dangerous middle ground between safety and intimate range. Imagine what two ghosts could accomplish together. How many lives could be spared the senseless slaughter? The proposition hung between them, audacious in its simplicity. Not an American and a Vietnamese forming unlikely alliance, but two ghosts, operating in the spaces between, guided not by ideology but by the more fundamental imperative to minimize suffering in a conflict neither had chosen. Your commanders would never sanction it, Jack said, testing the concept rather than rejecting, and neither would mine. We have no commanders now, Mai Lin replied, only our conscience, our oath to the ghost we carry, She reached slowly into her pocket, extracting something Jack couldn't immediately identify. Nguyen Bao left this for whoever proved worthy of taking his place. I believe he meant it for you, though he could not have known it would be you who finally found him. She extended her hand, revealing a tarnished silver medallion on a simple cord, a battlefield talisman common among Vietnamese fighters, though this one bore unusual markings. A sand crane and a tiger, Mai Lin explained, noting Jack's questioning glance at the imagery. The healer and the warrior, forever linked, forever separate. He carried it from the day we parted paths, he to become the Whisper, I to become what I am now. Jack accepted the medallion, its weight insignificant in his palm yet somehow monumentally heavy with meaning. The final message from a worthy adversary, a passing of responsibility from one ghost to another. What exactly are you proposing? He asked, though part of him already knew, had perhaps known since the moment he'd walked away from the hospital, from his former identity, from the war as others fought it, that we honor those we have lost by preventing more loss, Mai Lin said simply. That we use our skills not to further one side's agenda, but to moderate the worst of the conflict, to save those who can be saved. It wasn't peace she was offering. Wasn't redemption or forgiveness or any of the clean, comfortable concepts taught in Montana churches or Buddhist temples. It was something far more primal, more honest. The acknowledgement that in a war without meaning, the only meaning to be found was in the individual choices made by those caught in its machinery. Jack studied the medallion once more before slipping it over his head, letting it rest against his chest beside the Whisper's playing cards. Not an acceptance, not yet, but a recognition of the path being offered. I need time, he said finally. To think, Mai Lin nodded, understanding in her eyes. The ghost walks his own path as he must. She gestured toward a ridgeline barely visible through the rain and gathering darkness. I have a shelter there, supplies, medicine that might help your shoulder heal properly. A practical offer devoid of sentiment. You would be welcome to share it while you decide. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. Whatever you choose, ghost, know this. Nguyen Bao died as he wished to die, facing a worthy opponent, testing his skill against the best. He would not want his death avenged, only honored through the continued excellence of the one who bested him. With that, she melted into the jungle darkness, leaving Jack alone with the rain and the weight of decision. He stood motionless for long minutes, feeling the pull of competing ghosts. Hawk urging vengeance, the Whisper counseling respect. His father speaking of honor, and beneath it all, the whisper of his own conscience. When he finally moved, it was with the fluid grace that had become second nature, neither following Mai Lin nor turning away, but charting his own course parallel to hers. Not acceptance, not rejection, observation, consideration. The hunter's assessment of terrain, both physical and moral. The rain continued unabated as night claimed the jungle completely. Jack navigated by instinct now, by the internalized map of a landscape that had become an extension of himself. The distant lights of the VC camp disappeared behind him. The unseen presence of Firebase Conroy lay somewhere beyond the horizon to the west. Between them stretched the domain of ghosts, of those who no longer belonged fully to either world. He paused atop a small rise, surveying the darkened valley below where conflict had raged for generations. French versus Vietnamese, American versus Vietnamese, Vietnamese versus Vietnamese. An endless cycle of violence justified by ideologies that meant nothing to the dead, regardless of the uniform they wore in life. The medallion rested cool against his skin, a tangible reminder of the Whisper's final message. The playing cards tucked in his breast pocket carried Hawk's memory. The debt paid, but the loss still present. The Dragunov across his back represented the skills that had transformed him from soldier to legend, all of it weighing his spirit, all of it liberated from conventional meaning in this liminal space between worlds. As the rain finally began to slacken, Jack made his decision. Not with words or dramatic gestures, but with the simple act of turning toward the distant ridge where Mai Lin had indicated her shelter lay. Not following, but choosing. Not surrendering to another's path, but recognizing where his own had been leading since he first entered the jungle's embrace. The ghost moved through the night, a shadow among shadows, carrying the weight of those who had fallen and the responsibility of those who might yet be saved. Hawk walked beside him in memory. The whisper's wisdom guided his steps, and ahead, perhaps waited a new kind of purpose, not victory or defeat, but balance in a world torn by extremes. Jack Merritt had entered Vietnam as a soldier, bound by oath to one side of an arbitrary conflict. He had become the ghost, bound by deeper oaths to the spaces between, to the fundamental truths that transcended national interests and political ideologies. As he disappeared into the jungle's darkness, the rain stopped completely, leaving behind the heavy silence that follows nature's fury. In that silence, something new took root. Not peace, not yet, but the whisper of possibility. The first step on a path few would understand, but some might glimpse in moments of clarity between the fog of war. Silent retribution had been exacted. Silent redemption now began. Ghost to ghost, hunter to healer. Balance in all things. The jungle accepted him completely, and the legend grew. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.